Chapter 371. Tai Hu. Lu Chen was shocked. He was not unfamiliar with this name as he had heard of it before. In fact, in the vast land of the Divine Continent, at least in the cultivation world, there were not many cultivators who did not know of this name. He was one of the 6 divine transformation stage perfected lords of the Alliance of True Immortals, the famous and influential perfected Lord Ironpot. Who didn't know him? However, after a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "There are hundreds of millions of people in the Divine Continent. There are countless people with the same name. If we only rely on this name, I'm afraid I can't determine which one is the person you are looking for." Tian Lang nodded, but his expression remained the same. He said, "That person's cultivation is extremely high. He was able to enter the Great Snow Mountain and meet me. In terms of cultivation level, he is already at the peak of the human race. So, can you find that person?" Lu Chen exhaled softly, then nodded with a slightly serious expression. Since Sirius had already said it to this extent, it couldn't be anyone else. It had to be that Supreme Tai Hu from the True Immortal Alliance. However, he did not expect that in the deepest part of the chaotic land, in the Great Snow Mountain, which was known as one of the most dangerous places in the world, Tai Hu Lord would actually be related to the ancient beast here. For some reason, Lu Chen faintly felt that this matter was not normal. However, he could not think of too many things at the moment. He could only say to Tian Lang, "If that's the case, I already know who that person is. What do you want me to do? Please tell me." Tian Lang did not speak immediately. Instead, he stared at Lu Chen. After a moment, he said, "You guys follow me first." After that, he turned around and walked towards the north. Lu Chen and Atsu looked at each other and followed. It was just that the Great Snowy Mountain was extremely steep, and since ancient times, there had been no signs of human habitation, so there were no roads to speak of. Although Lu Chen could see that the ancient celestial wolf had slowed down, he still couldn't catch up. However, at this moment, the benefits of raising a dog for 1,000 days could be seen. Atsu very consciously came over and barked at Lu Chen. It looked as if it was disgusted. Then, Lu Chen could only laugh dryly and climb onto Atsu's back. Then, Atsu started to run. It was at this moment that Lu Chen finally understood why this fellow could run in a place like the Great Snow Mountain as if it was running on flat ground. It seemed like it had inherited some of its father's powerful ancient bloodline. In the midst of this, Tian Lang turned around to take a look. When it saw Atsu carrying Lu Chen on its back, it paused for a moment as if it was unhappy. However, when it saw Atsu's cheerful and honest look, it did not show any signs of being forced. In the end, Tian Lang could only silently shake its head and continue to run forward. With Atsu as a means of transportation, their speed instantly increased by several folds. Later on, even Sirius quickened his pace. 2 wolves, one big and one small, sprinted through the Great Snowy Mountain range. Even though the snow falling from the sky gradually became heavier, it could not stop their strong and fast bodies that were as fast as lightning. There were dangers everywhere in the Great Snow Mountain, but they were safe and sound along the way. Naturally, this was not because Lu Chen and the others were too lucky. The main reason was basically the existence of Tian Lang, which was more ferocious and more powerful than all the hidden beasts around them. After running for a long time, passing countless peaks, braving the wind and snow, they finally came to the foot of a big mountain. Lu Chen soon found a huge cave at the foot of the mountain. Tian Lang led him and Atsu into the cave. A cave that could accommodate the hill-like body of Tian Lang was naturally huge for Lu Chen. Before he entered the cave, he was already prepared in his heart. He thought that this kind of fierce beast's lair would most likely have piles of bones piled up like a mountain. The terrifying scene would make one's scalp numb. As for the stench, it was needless to say. Who knew that after he entered the cave, he was shocked. This huge lair of Tian Lang was unusually clean and tidy. There was no trace of the piles of bones that he imagined, and there was nothing terrifying to be afraid of. Well, except for the giant beast itself. After staying in the cave for a long time, Lu Chen suddenly realized that he didn't smell the stench that most wild beasts had in their caves. This huge cavern was actually just a huge cavern, and there were no other small paths. After Sirius arrived, he laid down in the middle of the cavern and signaled for Lu Chen to rest in a corner of the cavern. Then he called Atu over. What Tianlang said to Atsu, Lu Chen did not hear at all. Perhaps there was a special way of communication between wolves, or perhaps Tianlang was too powerful. Lu Chen did not know if Tianlang cast a spell to hinder his hearing. In short, Lu Chen did not hear anything for the whole day. He just watched Atsu stay beside Tianlang, quietly listening to something. There were a few times when Tianlang stretched out a front paw to gently touch Atsu's head and body. When Lu Chen saw that action, he felt that it really seemed like a kind of action between father and son. After the initial indifference, as the communication increased, Tianlang seemed to begin to become closer to Atsu. After a night like this, the snow outside became heavier and heavier. Later, it finally became a snowstorm that existed in the Great Snow Mountain. However, in this lair of Tianlang, the snow seemed to be a very distant thing for Lu Chen. Lu Chen spent a very peaceful night here. At some point in the middle of the night, Lu Chen suddenly woke up from his deep sleep. Then, he saw a strange rainbow light appear in what should have been a pitch-black cave. Atu lay quietly beside Sirius, while Sirius stared at him, one of its front paws resting on Atu's head. The dazzling rainbow light was emitted from the forehead where they touched, then turned into a dreamy radiance, surrounding Atsu's entire body in the light. From Lu Chen's point of view, Atsu's entire body seemed to be glowing, as if something in its body had been awakened. It began to bloom and emit power. From a distance, he could even hear the bones in Atsu's body creaking and shaking nonstop. For some reason, although Lu Chen could not see what Tianlang was doing to Atsu, for no reason, a few words such as rebirth and change the meridians and marrow suddenly emerged in his mind. He lay in the darkness and quietly watched this strange scene. Then, at some point, he quietly fell asleep again. When he opened his eyes at dawn, he saw Atsu. He did not know when the black dog had returned to his side. Perhaps it was because they had been relying on each other for so many years that it had become a habit. Atu still habitually nestled his head against his body. His body was very warm. Lu Chen smiled and reached out to pat its head. Tianlang let them stay in this cave for 3 days. During this period, Tianlang would perform that strange trick on Atsu every night. As for the effect, Lu Chen could not tell for the time being. At least, Atsu did not seem to have changed significantly. On the 4th day, Tianlang finally seemed to be a little tired and let them leave. This time, Tianlang directly led the two of them out of the Great Snowy Mountain and arrived at the border between the Great Snowy Mountain and the Land of Chaos. It was also here that Lu Chen finally heard what Tianlang told him. Go find the person called Iron Pot and tell him, Tianlang said to Lu Chen, it's time to return the leaf that he borrowed back then. Chapter 372. Do you know what leaf is? After descending from the Great Snow Mountain, Lu Chen watched as the ancient giant beast turned around and disappeared into the vast snowy mountains, leaving only Atu and Lu Chen standing at the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen asked Atu. Atsu shook its head, indicating that it knew nothing about it. Lu Chen felt a little helpless, so he turned around and walked forward. Atsu followed beside him. The snowstorm around them was getting weaker and weaker. The white faded away and the greenery gradually flourished. Unknowingly, they seemed to have walked into another world. Recalling the past, recalling the inexplicable days spent in the southern wilderness, Lu Chen could only sigh and sigh with emotion. However, when the flourishing scenes of life reappeared before his eyes, the lush greenery and vibrant flora and fauna that were rarely seen in the southern wilderness, even though they were still in the dangerous depths of the Land of Chaos, Lu Chen still felt a sense of joy as though he was a wanderer who had returned home. For many years he had never felt such a feeling, but at this time, he unexpectedly experienced it. Perhaps no matter what, as a human, he could not give up the yearning in his heart. No matter how good the southern Xinjiang wilderness was, it could not keep his heart. This time, the place they came out from was, of course, not the place that Lu Chen and Atsu had come to a few years ago. Back then, they were forced to jump into the Longchuan River and were finally washed to the southern Xinjiang wilderness by the river water. This time, it was mostly thanks to Atsu's cheap giant beast father. In any case, Lu Chen felt that Sirius probably did not want a rare descendant to die in the land of chaos. Therefore, after Sirius brought them out of the great snowy mountain, they arrived at a place that they had never been to or heard of before. It looked like a green grassland with many hills and was full of vitality. However, the monsters that lived here were obviously more gentle. There were rarely any ferocious and terrifying monsters that gave people headaches. Occasionally, one or two aggressive monsters would appear, but Lu Chen and Atsu managed to deal with them one by one. Perhaps this was the shortcut? However, as he walked through this unknown grassland, Lu Chen soon discovered something unusual about Atsu. The most obvious thing was that the big dog's appetite had once again skyrocketed. Atsu was desperately eating, and it only ate the flesh and blood of demonic beasts. Ordinary beasts and even weaker demonic beasts were obviously not worthy of its attention. Lu Chen observed along the way. It seemed that the more powerful and vigorous the demonic beasts were, the more interested this big black dog was. Every day, Atsu was in a state of hunger. It always wanted to eat more, and as it ate crazily, the black dog became fiercer and fiercer. Atsu was getting stronger and stronger. Lu Chen clearly felt this. He saw with his own eyes that a large number of monsters on this grassland, from weak to strong, from small to large, were slowly entering the menu of Atsu, and then in turn, stimulating Atsu to become stronger. The strength of this dog was growing by leaps and bounds. Lu Chen had never seen any kind of monster that could have such a terrifying growth. Perhaps this was the power of the ancient bloodline? Then, Lu Chen quickly thought of the strange things that he secretly saw Sirius doing to Atsu during those nights in the den of Sirius, and the dazzling and swaying rainbow light around Atsu. Would this dog grow into a giant beast like Sirius in the future? Lu Chen couldn't help but think so. This terrifying rate of growth continued for 7 days. It wasn't until the two of them had walked across the wide grassland that Atsu's seemingly bottomless appetite finally began to slow down. It then told Lu Chen the reason why it had become docile. It was probably because it had eaten too much recently, so it was temporarily on an empty stomach and stopped hunting those unlucky demon beasts for no good reason. Lu Chen looked back at the road they came from. Around the road that passed through the vibrant grassland, there were probably countless monsters that had fallen. Atsu was 2 times fatter than when it first came down from the snowy mountain. Now, it was already a real huge black wolf. Just by standing, Atsu's body had already exceeded Lu Chen's head. As it walked, it exuded an awe-inspiring aura. That magnificent aura made it look like the king of the grassland. But it was no wonder. Along the way, almost all the big and small demonic beasts on the prairie had been harmed by Atsu and Lu Chen. Even if there were some particularly powerful ones that Atsu couldn't defeat for the time being, they were often defeated by Lu Chen, who was helping the tyrant with all kinds of cunning tricks, and became Atsu's tonic. Then, on the 7th day, they walked to the other side of the grassland. Immediately, they saw a large river appear in their field of vision. The Dragon River. At last they saw the river again. The Dragon River was the dividing line between the most dangerous inner region and the central region of the Land of Chaos. As long as they crossed this river and continued north, they would most likely encounter humans like Lu Chen once they reached the central region of the Land of Chaos. Of course, the people they met might not necessarily be their friends. However, Lu Chen was still very happy and his mood quickly improved. As he stood by the riverbank and observed the situation of the Dragon River, he even had the mood to ask Atsu, who was standing beside him, "You're finally back. After crossing the river, do you have a destination in mind?" This time, Atsu reacted quickly. It barked at Lu Chen and drew a few lines on the ground with its paw. At first, Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. He scolded Atsu, "I don't really understand what you're saying. I was wondering when you would be able to cultivate to the level of that Sirius and imitate our human language." Of course, it would not be easy to reach the level of Sky Wolf's ability to speak human language. In fact, it was very likely that this ability could only be achieved by reaching the peak of the demon beasts. Naturally, Atsu was still far from it. However, when Lu Chen's gaze swept across the lines that Atsu had drawn on the ground, he found it funny at first. However, his smile suddenly froze as if he had seen something under Atsu's paw. After a while, Atsu retracted its front paw and took a few steps back. Luchen slowly walked over and squatted on the ground. He looked at the messy lines on the ground. After a while, he reached out a hand and gently drew on the soil. Some were unnecessary lines, some were mistakes made by Atsu due to its inexperience, and some were not very obvious. However, as his fingers moved, a simple drawing gradually appeared on the ground. The drawing was very simple. It was so simple that one could barely see the uneven and crooked lines formed by a few strokes. It looked like an undulating mountain range. Luchen looked at it silently for a while and then raised his head. Atsu's head was not far in front of him, and it was also staring at him. Luchen asked, "Do you want to go back to Kunlun Mountain first?" Atsu nodded. Luchen said, "Why do we go back? That place no longer welcomes us." His voice suddenly stopped, and then there seemed to be a gloomy expression on his face. He looked at Atsu and sighed softly. "So, you want to go back and see her again?" Luchen asked softly. Atsu nodded and barked, "Woof." Chapter 373. Luchen pondered for a long time on the southern bank of the Longchuan River. In the end, he did not choose to return to Kunlun Mountain. Of course, he did not forget Xianxia. She was a young girl with a smile as bright and warm as the sun. Even after so many years, her voice and smile could not be erased from his heart. However, it was not good to return to Kunlun Mountain. During that full moon night, many things happened. Luchen killed the young master of the Su family, Sumo. After his identity was exposed, he was hunted down by both the righteous and evil sections. If he returned, he would easily alert his old enemies. As for Xianxia, she had died that day. After Luchen avenged her, he had fled. It was probably the Yi family who helped her with her funeral arrangements. If he went back to look for her now, he would not even know where her grave was. He would have to secretly pry for her whereabouts. This was another matter that could easily alert others. However, the most important part of the matter was not this. Up until now, Luchen still couldn't figure out who that damned Baldy was, and he couldn't understand him. That person held a high position as a supreme, and his words carried enormous weight in the Kunlun Mountains and the surrounding areas. It could be said that he was already a supreme existence in a dignified and prestigious sect. However, at this point, Luchen still did not dare to say that he could completely trust him. Even when he suddenly recalled his childhood in the southern wilderness, whenever he returned to the chaotic lands and approached the human race, he would instinctively be wary of this true monarch Tianlun. The damned Baldy's heart was as deep as the ocean, and his cultivation was frighteningly high. As for his unpredictable methods, there was no need to mention anything else. At the very least, Luchen himself was taught by him. There was no one else in this world who knew more about the Baldy than Luchen. If possible, he would not want to be enemies with the Baldy. However, he did not know what Baldy thought of him now. Perhaps the greatest sorrow of being in the shadow business was that it was difficult to trust someone completely. Luchen made his decision and informed Atsu. Of course, he couldn't explain it in such detail to a dog, so he tried to simplify it as much as possible. He said to Atsu, "There's no hurry with Kunlun Mountain. Instead, let's go to the Immortal City and help him with the things that your cheap father told us to do." Woof, Atsu didn't seem to be very insistent. Perhaps for the sake of Luchen, he gave him some face. He mumbled a few words and followed him. Since the goal was set, the Longchuan River in front of him became the biggest problem to overcome. Neither Luchen nor Atsu had forgotten the scene of falling into the river, and neither of them wanted to try it again. However, the Longchuan River flowed right in front of them, with no end in sight. Luchen stood by the river and was at a loss of what to do. "This is going to be a bit troublesome," Luchen muttered to himself with a frown. His eyes were already scanning the surrounding terrain, especially the areas with trees. He was already thinking if he could build a simple boat or raft to float across the water. However, if this section of the Longchuan River did indeed have some powerful and terrifying river beasts, once they were discovered, the small boats, wooden rafts and the like would be no different from papier-mâché once they were discovered. At that time, if they fell into the river again, the same thing would probably happen again. For many years, the deeper the land of chaos went, the fewer cultivators who could reach this place. Most of those who could cross the Longchuan River were perfected cultivators in the Yuanying realm. At such a high cultivation level, flying was a remarkable ability that most people could master. Naturally, they would not be as troubled as Lu Chen and Atsu. Just as Lu Chen's head was aching, and he was deep in thought, Atsu walked up to him from the side. He looked at Lu Chen, and there was a hint of disdain in his eyes. Lu Chen saw it and immediately became angry. He said, "What are you looking at? It's not like you don't know what's under the Longchuan River. Our cultivation level is not high enough, so it's very difficult to cross." Atsu snorted and even wagged its tail. It did not seem to mind Lu Chen's words at all. Instead, it looked a little proud. Lu Chen was a little puzzled. He stared at the big black dog that was slightly taller than him and said, "Why, you seem to disagree?" Atsu barked twice and walked straight to the Longchuan River. Lu Chen watched it walk all the way to the riverside. Then he saw the black dog look up at the sky. Its aura suddenly became especially imposing and arrogant. Suddenly, it roared twice. The dog's barking spread far and wide, drifting on the wide surface of the Longchuan River. It was loud, but the feedback was not loud. Lu Chen watched from the side for a long time, only to see that the surface of the river was calm and there was no reaction. Lu Chen walked to Atsu's side and patted the dazed Atsu. He said with a smile, "Although I don't know what you want to do, it seems that you did not succeed." Atsu looked angry, but also a little confused. At this moment, it seemed to have doubts about its own intelligence. It squatted by the river and stared at the river for a long time. All of a sudden, the black dog jumped up as if it had thought of something, and Lu Chen, who was standing beside it, jumped in fright. Atsu barked twice at the Longchuan River, but this time, the sound was much shorter. Then, it suddenly spat out something from its mouth. Lu Chen saw it clearly and realized that it seemed to be a golden stone the size of half a fist. The golden stone fell to the ground and rolled a few times before falling into the Longchuan River. Suddenly, there was a flash of golden light, and the water bubbled. The golden stone disappeared into the depths of the river in the blink of an eye. Then, Atsu solemnly barked a few times at the Longchuan River like before. The Longchuan River seemed to be so calm and did not seem to have any reaction. Lu Chen walked to Atsu's side and touched the somewhat dazed dog's head. He smiled and said, "What is that stone? Where did it come from?" Atsu looked very stunned. After a while, it turned around and barked in the direction it came from. Lu Chen thought for a while and said, "Did Sirius give it to you?" Atsu nodded. Lu Chen spread his hands and didn't know what to say for a moment. He thought to himself, perhaps the thing that Heavenly Wolf gave its son was also a treasure? At least when the golden stone was revealed for a short period of time, it looked quite magnificent. However, in the blink of an eye, it was thrown into the Longchuan River. He wondered what expression Sirius would have if he knew what had happened today. While the two of them were in a daze by the riverbank, a majestic aura suddenly came from the river. Before Lu Chen and Atsu could react, a huge tentacle suddenly broke out of the river and landed with a loud bang. It brought with it a large wave and directly gushed over. Lu Chen and Atsu's reactions were not slow. When they saw the wave rise, they hurriedly jumped away, avoiding the fate of being drenched. However, very soon, their eyes were fixed on the huge creature that suddenly appeared in the river. The tentacle, which was thicker than their bodies and several tens of feet long, was actually just one of the tentacles of the giant beast in the river. The part of the tentacle that was exposed above the water looked like an incomparably huge octopus. Its two huge black eyes stared down at the two ants on the riverbank from above. The huge creature looked at Lu Chen and then at Atsu. After a while, a hoarse and ear-piercing voice suddenly echoed in their ears. "Wolf cub, did your perverted father ask you to find me?" Chapter 374. Lu Chen stared at the gigantic creature that had suddenly emerged from the Dragon River. He wasn't too surprised. Perhaps it was because he had been in the Bedlam lands for a long time. Especially this time, he had seen too many strange creatures and beasts that he had never seen before. He was a little numb to them. He even had the leisure to turn around to look at Atsu, only to see that the black dog seemed to be startled as well and was a little dumbfounded. After a while, the giant octopus monster spoke impatiently in their ears again. At the same time, a giant tentacle reached out from the river. It was holding the golden stone that Atsu had thrown into the river. Atu immediately reacted and hurriedly nodded his head. The giant octopus monster snorted coldly. This time, its voice was like thunder, causing their ears to buzz. The octopus said unhappily, "It's just a small favor. You wolves are so stingy. It's been a few thousand years and you still want to collect your debt." Lu Chen and Atu looked at each other in dismay. Lu Chen gave Atu a look with a questioning look in his eyes, but Atu immediately shook his head with an expression that said, "I don't know what happened to Father Heavenly Wolf back then either." The giant octopus looked a little indignant, but after complaining for a while, it slammed its tentacles into the water a few times, stirring up a big splash. Then, it said to Atu as if it had accepted its fate, "Tell me, what do you want me to do for you?" As it spoke, it suddenly glared at them and said, "There's only one thing. You are not allowed to leave the Longchuan River. Otherwise, I won't pay for it." Lu Chen and Atsu looked at each other. After a while, they said in unison, "Oh no," they said it in unison, but they pointed at the opposite bank of the Longchuan River. "Cross the river, we want to cross the river." Woof 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 woof. About an hour later, when they came down from the giant octopus, they had already reached the opposite bank of the Longchuan River. To them, the Longchuan River was extremely difficult and dangerous. But to this giant octopus, crossing it was as easy as taking a few steps at home. The octopus seemed to be in a good mood. It was probably relieved that a promise from years ago had been fulfilled in such a relaxed manner. It didn't even bother to explain anything to these two ants. After sending them to the north bank of the Longchuan River, it turned around and dived back into the river, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Lu Chen looked at the vast river and was amazed for a moment. He wondered what kind of vast underwater world it was that could accommodate so many giant beasts and all kinds of incredible creatures. At this time, Atu called out from beside him. Lu Chen turned around and saw Atu looking at him with a smug look on his face. It was as if he was asking for praise from someone who didn't live up to his expectations. Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said unhappily, "I know, it's all thanks to you this time. It's good to have a good father." Atsu responded. After crossing the Dragon River, they were still within the boundaries of the disorienting lands. However, it was obvious that they were in the outer regions. The danger level of the various hidden monsters had decreased significantly. Lu Chen and Atu had a much easier time dealing with them. At this time, Atu's soaring strength had gradually shown itself. Along the way, most of the time, it was not them who avoided or resisted the demon beasts. Instead, it was Atu who would often find trouble with the demon beasts. From time to time, he would bring back one or two prey to add to his meal. Lu Chen's strength had also improved greatly. However, his situation was very special. It could be said that he was different from most cultivators in the human cultivation world. The traditional foundation establishment, Jindan, and Yuanying realms didn't seem to have any meaning for him. At that moment, Lu Chen's skills and cultivation base were more similar to the shaman priests of the berserkers in the south. With black fire as his foundation, he had also learned quite a few strange and unfathomable shaman arts over the past few years. According to his own speculation, with his current strength, there was no doubt that he could defeat the foundation establishment cultivators of the human race. Even if he were to fight against Jindan Friar, he should be able to put up a fight. However, if it was a powerful cultivator of the Yuanying realm, Lu Chen still had some doubts. After thinking about it, those Yuanying spiritual masters were all powerful cultivators. How could it be so easy to catch up to them? At the same time, Lu Chen also thought of something that he had noticed before. The reversed aura of the 5 elements in the disorienting land didn't seem to have much effect on him anymore. This was especially obvious when he came over from the Great Snow Mountain. Lu Chen wasn't sure why, but he thought that it was probably related to the great increase in the power of the black flame in his body during this trip to the southern border. 1 man and 1 dog headed north. On the second day after they left the Longchuan River, they met a person. Yes, a human cultivator adventurer. That was the first person that Lu Chen and Atsu had seen in a few years. At that moment, it was hard to describe Lu Chen's feelings. He couldn't help but stare at the person in front of him for a long time. Atsu also looked very excited. It jumped and roared as if it was celebrating. After all, it had lived among the human race for many years. In the past, it had seen people like Lu Chen. At this moment, it probably felt a sense of familiarity. However, this scared the cultivator half to death. The land of chaos was fraught with danger. Aside from the various hidden dangers, there were also ferocious demonic beasts that roamed about. There was also the possibility of people plotting and killing each other. Thus, when he saw that the person opposite him was staring at him with malicious intent, and the incomparably large black wolf demonic beast next to him was roaring angrily with a menacing aura, as if it wanted to devour someone, the cultivator screamed, turned around and ran away. He ran very fast. Lu Chen and Atsu were left behind, their faces filled with shock. After that, Lu Chen and Atsu became more careful and restrained. After the initial excitement and joy, they quickly calmed down. This was the disorienting lands. Even the human race could be ruthless enemies here. Although it felt very dangerous, Lu Chen didn't feel uncomfortable. On the contrary, he actually felt a sense of familiarity. If it wasn't for the fact that he had always been calm and couldn't do something like, "I'm back," to the mountains and forests like a fool, he might have sighed. Now that his cultivation was high and he was strong, the path that was difficult and dangerous in the past suddenly felt easy. They walked out of the disorienting land safely and smoothly. On the 6th day, they finally reached the edge of the disorienting land and left this chaotic land. Of course, the place they came out from was not the Crescent City from back then. In fact, in order to avoid people's eyes and ears, Lu Chen had specially chosen a remote exit to leave. On the way, he asked the locals for a bit and finally found out their approximate location. They were far away from the western continent where Kunlun Mountain was located, but they were much closer to the Immortal City towards the Central Plains. Could this be heaven's will? Lu Chen said casually to Atsu, then continued north. Everything seemed to be going to be like this, but as they walked, Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly slowed down. Atsu looked at Lu Chen suspiciously, only to see Lu Chen's expression suddenly become a little strange. He seemed to have thought of something a little lost, but also a little yearning. After a moment, the man suddenly laughed, then said to Atsu, "I thought of something. On the way to the Immortal City, if we make a slight turn, we will actually pass by a place where I used to live. Do you want to go take a look with me?" Lu Chen glanced towards a certain direction in the distance and said, "Are you asking about that place?" "Yes, it's a small village in the mountains, extremely poor, but it's a very quiet and beautiful place." As he said that, he smiled and said, "At the foot of T Mountain, Qingshatang Village." Chapter 375. Lu Chen had lived in Qingshatang Village for 10 whole years. During that period of time, he was like an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. He had his own joys and sorrows, and he experienced or even seemed to possess the life of an ordinary person. But sometimes, in some unknown place, he seemed to be a cold and lonely shadow, standing alone in a dark corner, looking at the world coldly. There was a huge gap between him and the ordinary people in the village, and he could never blend in. Therefore, when Lu Chen once again saw the tall T Mountain from afar and the village entrance at the foot of the mountain, he saw the fertile farmlands on both sides of the flat road, and there were people planting seedlings inside. He was in a trance for a moment, feeling as if he had turned back into the idle, joking, and scolding Lu Chen in the village. He composed himself, then patted Atsu beside him, pointed to the T Mountain in the distance, and said, "You're too big now. Not only will you scare people easily when you enter the village, you'll also attract unnecessary trouble. Go around the side and play on the mountain. I'll go to the Dragon Lake at the top of the mountain to find you later." Atsu looked at him, but did not show any emotion. After wagging its tail, it ran off on its own. The surrounding mountains were undulating, and very soon, Atsu's figure disappeared into the wilderness. Seeing that Atsu had left, Lu Chen turned and walked towards the entrance of Xianxia village. The closer he got, the clearer the surrounding scenery became. Just like what he remembered, there were not many people on the road outside the village. Other than the occasional traveling merchants, he remembered that the busiest time of the month was probably when the people from the nearby Thousand Autumn sect came to purchase spiritual materials. The villagers who worked in the farmlands rarely raised their heads to look. Occasionally, some of them would look in Lu Chen's direction, but there was no emotion in their eyes. Instead, it was a look of numbness to life, to the world, and to their own fate. Lu Chen's gaze swept across the farmlands and the working people on both sides of the road, and then he walked over. He had lived here for 10 years, and was used to this scene very early on. In fact, the way these working people looked was the impression he had of most people in Xianxia village. For the so-called illusory hope of becoming an immortal, they spent their entire lives risking their lives. They worked hard to accumulate wealth and went to gamble once. Then, they lost everything, including all their money and their lives. In these 10 years, he had seen too many people like this. In Lu Chen's memory, the scenery in this village was fresh and beautiful, but the color of the people in this village was gray. However, Lu Chen did not belittle or look down on these ordinary people because in those 10 years, he had always been one of them, although at that time, he could only be regarded as a somewhat cynical and unusual person. Who did not want to become an immortal? Who did not want to go straight to the top and be the center of attention? The dreams of ants wanting to soar high were never wrong. The only wrong was that they were ultimately powerless against fate. It was like a chasm in front of them that was difficult to cross, like a flight of stairs that was difficult to climb. They were angry, in pain, roaring, then sad, disappointed, but they refused to give up, and they would not despair. Thus, day after day, year after year, they became numb to the passage of time. Lu Chen walked into the village, and at that moment, he suddenly felt as if he had walked into the past. Everything in front of him seemed to be the same as before, and the Xianxia village in front of him was also the peaceful little mountain village of the past. His gaze involuntarily looked in a certain direction. In those 10 long years, in his memory, most of the people in the village were gray in color, but he still remembered that there was once a beautiful woman, who was a unique and beautiful scenery in his memory. She was Ding Dang, that passionate woman. She was still young, and at that time, she had not completely lost hope in life. In that period of time, she seemed to be the only shining light in this village. Until he suppressed the pain of his memories, Lu Chen began to look around the situation. The village was obviously livelier than the outside of the village. There were more people coming and going, and quite a few people noticed Lu Chen walking into the village. However, no one went up to ask or do anything else. The people here seemed to be wary of outsiders. What made Lu Chen a little surprised was that when he looked around, he could still vaguely recognize a few familiar faces in the crowd, but the villagers who originally lived here did not seem to recognize him. It was as if Lu Chen had never lived here before, as if Lu Chen had been erased from their memories. Lu Chen was a little surprised, but of course it was impossible for him to go up and grab these villagers, and then go and greet them, pretending to be reunited after a long time, as if he was reunited with his family. In fact, when he was in this village, other than Old Ma, Ding Dang, and a few others who were familiar with him, the others were at most acquaintances who nodded at him. Their relationship was very ordinary. It was probably because of this that those people forgot about him very quickly. Lu Chen shook his head and did not pay attention to these people, and walked along the familiar bluestone path. On the side of the stone road was the clear stream. After so many years, the stream was still so clear that the bottom could be seen, and the pebbles and fish could be seen clearly. It was exactly the same as in his memory. The mountain breeze blew down from the distant mountains, causing layers of ripples on the clear stream. On the two sides of the stream, the bamboo and peach blossoms set off each other, creating a beautiful scene. The scene in front of him suddenly told Lu Chen that it was spring in this world again. Lu Chen smiled, and his mood suddenly became much better. Walking on the stone road, he watched the peach blossoms bloom and the petals fluttered in the wind. It was as if he could vaguely see that day, the beautiful woman standing under the peach blossom tree. She seemed to still have a smile on her face, raising her hand and waving it at him. It was the most enchanting and beautiful picture scroll in ordinary life. Lucian walked past the peach tree, stretched out his hand, and broke off a peach branch from the tree. A faint fragrance greeted him. The peach blossoms bloomed like a smiling face, as if laughing at his busy and dreamy life in the world. Lucian grinned, smiled at the peach blossom in his hand, and said softly, "You should be relaxed now, right? Wait for me, I'll go see you later." With that, he casually put the peach blossom in his arms, and then walked away. Unknowingly, he arrived at the fork in the road, and a familiar big locust tree appeared in front of him, growing next to the clear water stream. Lucian looked over, and subconsciously looked at the big rock by the shore under the tree. In his memory, every day, there would be an old fisherman with the surname Yu sitting here fishing. But on this day, although the weather was good, the rock under the tree was empty. Lucian was stunned, stood there for a while, and then silently turned around and walked away. Walking along the road into the village, he soon saw the most familiar house in his memory. Nothing had changed here. That house was still a tavern. Even the word wine, written on the door, seemed to be the same as it was in the past. Everything was the same as in his memory, as if he had never left. Lucian was a little surprised, and then smiled. He thought to himself, the business opened by Old Ma is destined to lose money, and there is really someone who will take over and continue to open the pub? Are they stupid? However, looking at the flag with the word wine on it, he suddenly felt like drinking. So he strode over. Countless memories of the past surged into his mind, and he felt a burst of warmth in his heart, although he didn't know where fatty Old Ma was now. With this thought in his mind, he stepped in, and at the same time said, "Boss, give me 2 jugs of wine." His voice suddenly stopped, and he stood at the door of the pub, with a stunned expression on his face, and looked at the counter in the pub. He saw that behind the counter, a fat man turned around with some difficulty, looked at Lucian, curled his lips, and said unhappily, You've become good at drinking, didn't you only ask for a jug of wine before?" Chapter 376. Lucian stared at the fat man and didn't speak for a long time. The expression on his face was a little strange. The fat man standing behind the counter also looked at Lucian. A smile appeared on the corner of his mouth as if he had let out a long breath. Then he touched his face with a smile and said, "What's wrong? You haven't seen me for so long that you don't recognize me anymore?" This fat man was Old Ma. Lucian couldn't be more familiar with this face. They had known each other for decades and lived together in this secluded Xianxia village for 10 years. To put it bluntly, even if the fat Old Ma was disfigured, Lucian would still be able to recognize him at a glance. Lucian shook his head and suddenly smiled. Then he said, "You damn fat man, you're still alive? I won't die even if you die." Old Ma pointed this out to Lucian very seriously. Then he walked out from behind the counter and walked in front of Lucian. He smiled and opened his arms. He said, "But fortunately you're still alive. That's good." Lucian sighed. There seemed to be a look of contempt or impatience on his face, but in the end he still reached out his hands and hugged Old Ma. The 2 men hugged each other tightly. Seemingly intentionally or unintentionally, they each patted each other's back 3 times. Then, they each took a step back and looked at each other. Suddenly they laughed together. Lucian put away the black short sword in his right hand. Old Ma hid a sharp and tricky-looking spike in his sleeve. At the same time, he scolded jokingly, "Bastard, I saw that you really wanted to stab me in the stomach with the sword. I was so scared that I broke out in a cold sweat." Lucian spat and said disdainfully, "This kind of secret code after a long time was obviously thought up by you back then. I said it was useless, but you still wanted me to remember it. Now, you're the one making sarcastic remarks." Scram. Old Ma said bluntly, "What I'm doing is the right way. Thanks to my ideas, we were able to live a stable life for 10 years. As for those who didn't use my method, their bodies are now lying all over the streets of Immortal City." Lucian couldn't help but laugh. He waved his hand and said, "You're good, all right?" As he spoke, he sat down at the wine table by the window just like he did many years ago. He slammed the table and laughed loudly. "Boss, give me 2 jugs of wine." As the wine entered his stomach, the slightly intoxicating warmth spread throughout his body, giving him an indescribable sense of comfort. The tavern still looked the same as when they had stayed here many years ago. Business was poor and there were not many customers. There were only the 2 of them in the huge tavern at the moment. "Why did you come back here, old ma?" Lu Chen took a sip of wine and asked old ma, "Didn't you follow me to Kunlun Mountain and then open what's the name of that shop in Kunwa City?" Lu Chen thought carefully, but before he could answer, old ma said lightly, "Black Hill Pavilion." "Oh, that's the name," Lu Chen said with a smile. "Kunwa City is hundreds of times better than Qingshitang Village. Why did you come back?" Old ma seemed to be recalled by Lu Chen's words. After a moment of silence, he said, "When you publicly betrayed the Kunlun party, killed your way into Kunwa City's Su family, and finally fled to the ends of the world, I didn't have the mood to open that shop anymore. It just so happened that Lord Perfected Immortal had something for me to do, so I conveniently left the Kunlun party and went to Immortal City." "Immortal City?" Lu Chen suddenly frowned and asked. Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, I went to Immortal City to secretly investigate Fuyunji. Lord Perfected Immortal suspected that there was a mole from the devil cult in Fuyunji." Lu Chen's expression changed slightly and became serious. He said, "There is a mole in Fuyunji?" Old Ma took a deep breath and said, "Yes. Do you remember that you were attacked by people from Fuyunji when you were fleeing?" Lu Chen snorted and raised his eyelids. He looked at old Ma and said, "Someone wanted to kill me. Of course I remember it clearly. I still clearly remember that at that time, I thought that damned Baldy had completely given up on me and was preparing to send people to kill me to silence me." Old Ma shook his head and said, "That's not the case. Lord Perfected Immortal had already secretly ordered that people from Fuyunji were not allowed to oppose you, let alone chase after you. I heard these words from him with my own ears. They were absolutely not lies. However, I don't know what happened, but something unexpected happened. A portion of the Floating Cloud Division's men in the Land of Chaos started to attack you." Lu Chen looked indifferently at Old Ma and didn't say a word. Old Ma felt a bit helpless. He sighed and said, "I say, you're good at everything but you're too suspicious. I really didn't lie to you about this, and there's no need for me to lie to you." Lu Chen said, "So you found out about this?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, "It's not all my work. At least Shuang did a thorough check on her disciples. She probably found 3 or 4 people from Fuyunji. In the end, she confirmed that most of them were spies from the evil cult." Lu Chen was silent for a moment. Nowadays, the human race had been prosperous for many years. Many people had long lost interest in the rare evil cult. But in the human cultivation world, true Lord Tianlan of Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji under his rule were the vanguard against the evil cult. But now, even Fuyunji was found to have spies from the evil cult. From this, it could be imagined that after more than 10 years of hardship, their power and strength were completely different from before. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and casually asked Old Ma, "What happened to those who were caught?" Old Ma said, "At the East Market entrance of the Immortal City, they were executed in front of many people." Lu Chen was startled for a moment. He seemed a bit surprised and said, "Killed all of them?" Old Ma nodded and said with certainty, "Yes, killed all of them." No one in the tavern spoke for a while. Maybe it was because they heard that the spies hidden in Fuyunji were executed in public, or maybe it was some other reason. But after a moment, Lu Chen still asked Old Ma softly, "Is this what the damn Baldy wanted?" Old Ma was a bit hesitant. But after pondering for a moment, he still nodded slightly to Lu Chen and said, "Yes." "Okay, let's not talk about this." Lu Chen changed the topic and a smile appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and patted Old Ma's shoulder and said, "When I returned to this village, I thought that maybe there would be great changes here, or maybe it would still be the same as before. But I didn't expect that you actually came back here." Old Ma curled his lips and said, "It's nothing. I helped True Lord to do that thing, and after catching the spies, I didn't do anything else. So one day I suddenly thought that you wandered the world without any news. I didn't know where you would go. So in the end, I came back here and waited, hoping that you would come back one day. Lucian murmured, "It's really like that. In the vast sea of people, you actually found me." Old Ma laughed heartily and casually took a rag and wiped the table a few times. He then asked Lucian, "Oh right, I heard that when you were fleeing in the chaotic lands, not to mention how miserable it was, you often didn't have anything to eat for a whole day." Lucian snorted and lightly replied, "That's an exaggeration." Old Ma was obviously very familiar with Lucian. He put his hand on Lucian's shoulder and asked, "Oh right, where did you go after that? Why can't I find any news of you?" Lucian was a bit touched in his heart. He nodded and said, "If I said that I went to the southern wilderness these past few years, would you believe me?" Old Ma didn't even look at Lucian's sincere expression and calmly said, "Nonsense. I'd be a pig if I believed you." Chapter 377. Lucian laughed and said, "You are so fat. Whether you believe me or not, you still look like a pig." Old Ma spat, then waved his hand and said, "Don't give me that. I have been looking for you for the past few years. His Excellency has also given orders to Fuyunji to carefully search for your whereabouts, but they have not been able to find you. Where have you been hiding?" Lucian thought for a moment and said, "I went to the south." Old Ma made a sound of agreement and said, "I think so too. In this world, the only place that can escape from Fuyunji and the evil cult is the chaotic land of chaos." Lucian was silent for a moment and said, "Damn Baldy is still looking for me?" Old Ma seemed to sense something and his expression became serious. He looked at Lucian and said, "I have already told you that when you were suddenly chased by the people of Fuyunji while you were escaping, it was because the evil cult used a spy hidden in Fuyunji to give false orders. That is why it was a misunderstanding." Lucian's expression did not change much. He only said, "When did you find out?" Old Ma said, "It was His Excellency who felt something was wrong and secretly ordered me to go to Fuyunji to investigate. Then I found out about this." He glanced at Lucian with a hint of worry on his face. Even his voice had become a little deeper as he said, "You know me. I've never lied to you about something like this in all these years." Lucian slightly lowered his head, his expression indifferent. Old Ma could not tell what he was thinking at this moment, or whether he believed his words. After a while, Lucian asked again, "How did that damned Baldy react when he found out about this?" Old Ma immediately said, "After True Monarch heard about this, he was furious and immediately punished Fuyunji heavily. He carefully sifted through them from top to bottom, and even Xue Ying was killed. Let me tell you, I've followed True Monarch for so many years, but this is the first time I've seen him so angry. If Xue Ying wasn't his trusted aide who had followed him longer than me, and had always been loyal to him, risking her life for so many years, I'm afraid she wouldn't even be able to keep her position as the Hall Master of Fuyunji." Lucian remained silent for a short while before he said, "I never expected him to have such a huge reaction." Old Ma said, "Lucian, the True Monarch really thinks highly of you." Lucian raised his head and looked at Old Ma. After a moment he smiled. "Later, I'll send a secret report about your return and let True Monarch know that you're back." Lucian picked up the wine cup on the table in front of him, rubbed it for a while, but did not drink. He only said, "So urgent? Maybe there's no need to tell him so urgently." Old Ma frowned, looked at Lucian and said, "Do you have something in mind?" Lucian shook his head and said, "No, I just want to live a peaceful life this time." Without True Monarch's protection, you won't have a peaceful life at all. Old Ma pointed out this fact to Lucian mercilessly and straightforwardly. He said, "You've offended too many people, and the power of your enemies is too great. There are also many madmen who don't care about their own lives, and they have remarkable abilities. If you don't have a backer and only rely on your own strength, it will be very difficult for you to live comfortably." Lucian gave a wry smile and said, "You don't have to say it so clearly." Old Ma sneered and said, "Everything about you is good, but sometimes your thoughts are too complicated and you are too suspicious. You don't believe anyone. If I don't tell you directly, you will most likely think about it by yourself." These words of Old Ma were very serious, but Lucian did not get angry. He just drank the wine in his cup in one gulp, then nodded and said, "You are right, but this temperament was developed when I was in the devil sect. If I didn't do this, open my eyes even when I was asleep, be on guard every day, and constantly calculate, I'm afraid I wouldn't have lived until now." Old Ma suddenly stopped talking. After a long while, he gave a wry smile, and there was a hint of bitterness in his smile. He stood up and lightly patted Lu Chen's shoulder, but for a moment he did not know what to say. Lu Chen raised his head and looked at him, then suddenly smiled and said, "Come on, don't give me this kind of face, it makes me look like I'm going to die soon." Old Ma laughed and covered the bitterness on his face, then after a moment of silence, he still straightened his expression and looked at Lu Chen seriously and said, "To be honest, Lu Chen, listen to me, go back to the immortal city with me and see the Supreme. I don't dare, and I don't have the qualifications to promise you, but I feel that the relationship between the two of you is definitely not what you think it is. You have to believe him." Old Ma said to Lu Chen softly but very seriously. "Believe him?" Lu Chen thought for a while, then slowly nodded. "Then let's go back to the immortal city together? Okay, when are we leaving?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "It's better to be safe. I'll first send a secret report to the Supreme of the immortal city and let him send someone to make arrangements, so that there won't be any accidents on the way." He glanced at Lu Chen and said, "You know, there aren't many people in this world who can cause more trouble than you." Lu Chen rolled his eyes at him and said, "Okay then, you make the arrangements, I'm going out for a walk." Old Ma said, "Hey, are you really going out for a walk? Don't tell me you're going to disappear without a trace after leaving the door?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "You're crazy, can't you be more normal? You believe everything I say, don't you trust me that much?" Old Ma said sternly, "You shadows are not normal people. Get lost." Lu Chen felt that his emotions were unusually complicated. He was a little relaxed, but also a little worried and uneasy. No matter how he thought about it, it was probably because he still couldn't see through that damn Baldy. But who cares, things were like this. Actually, some of what Old Ma said was very right and very reasonable. From the beginning until now, he never had much of a choice. He had always been tied to that damn Baldy's pirate ship. If he didn't follow him, didn't believe him, what else could he do? Lu Chen strolled in the direction of the tea mountain. When he reached the foot of the tea mountain, he quickly saw the straw hut that he used to live in. Most of the people in this Xianxia village lived in the village. Back then, he was the only one who lived at the foot of the mountain. As for the reason, it was actually very simple. Every night, there would be a mournful sound of the wind that sounded like ghosts wailing and wolves howling. Not many people could bear it. Lu Chen felt a sense of familiarity as he looked at the lush greenery of the mountain and the familiar, light aroma of tea drifting in the wind. He looked around and thought to himself, could this be the legendary feeling of homecoming? He slowly walked to the side of the straw hut. No one had lived in it for a few years and it was very dilapidated. More than half of the thatch was gone, and the rest seemed to have rotted. The door was tightly shut, but there was a hole in the wall next to it. He didn't know who did it. Lu Chen walked over and pushed the door open. With a low squeak, the door slowly opened. A slightly moldy smell filled the air in the straw hut. Then there were those familiar things. Lu Chen stood at the door for a while. He looked up and saw that it was a dilapidated place. However, it wasn't like before, where a piece of thatch gently fell. It was like the time that he had spent in the past 10 years, which was finally gone forever. Lu Chen smiled and turned to leave. Then he walked up the tea mountain. On that mountain, Atsu should still be waiting for him. There was also a woman who was sleeping here. He also wanted to visit her. Let's just take it as a farewell to that period of time, if she's really watching from the heavens. Chapter 378. On the way up the mountain, Lu Chen saw some traces beside the thatched hut and the edge of the forest. He was reminded of the tragic battle that happened on the last night he was here. Now that time had passed, those traces had become smaller and fainter. Lu Chen immediately recalled the time when he walked into Xianxia village. He clearly remembered that the pursuit had affected the village, and that people had set many places on fire. However, the traces of the battle had basically disappeared this time. Everything had been covered up by new people, new houses, and new lives. Only the foot of the mountain far away from the village, a remote place where few people came, still had some traces of the battle. Lu Chen's gaze lingered on the traces by the roadside for a moment, then he walked up the tea mountain. In front of him was still a mountain full of green tea trees. When the mountain wind blew, the green leaves converged into a green ocean, undulating up and down. Countless spirit tea trees grew on this mountain peak. Everything was green as far as the eye could see. This also made the roads here extremely complicated and confusing. However, this was not a problem for Lu Chen. He had lived here for 10 years, and he had walked up and down this tea mountain countless times. He could walk the roads here even with his eyes closed. He walked much faster than a few years ago, probably because he had recovered a lot of his cultivation. Soon he reached the top of the mountain. There were forks in front of him, each leading in a different direction. One was the sinkhole, the other was the dragon lake. Lu Chen naturally walked towards the dragon lake. The mountain breeze that blew against his face gradually brought with it a trace of moisture. As he walked closer, the sound of water could be heard from the front. Lu Chen was slightly startled. In his memory, although the dragon lake at the top of the mountain was not small, the water was calm all year round. Even the tides were very weak. Other than some ripples in the mountain breeze, there was almost no other sound. When the weather was good, the scenery here was also extremely beautiful. It could be said to be worthy of the praise of the green mountains, clear waters, and smooth as a mirror. However, Lu Chen quickly thought of something. He frowned slightly and quickened his pace towards the dragon lake. Not long after, he walked to the edge of the dragon lake. Sure enough, he saw a huge black dog playing around in the beautiful dragon lake. It dived into the water for a while, came out for a while, and then slapped the water with all its might. The water splashed everywhere, and it was very lively. It was having a lot of fun. Lu Chen shook his head helplessly. He walked to the edge of the dragon lake and shouted towards the water, "Atsu, come up." Atu glanced at him and shook its head. It looked like it was unwilling to do so. Lu Chen coughed, then said solemnly, "Come back, there are demon beasts in the dragon lake. I heard that there is a very powerful and vicious fish." As he spoke, Lu Chen paused for a moment and then subconsciously recalled. It seemed that when he was still here a few years ago, someone seemed to have mentioned this to him. However, too many things happened after that and a long time had passed. He actually couldn't remember it clearly. After hearing Lu Chen's words in the dragon lake, Atsu was stunned at first, then it barked at him twice, and actually swam towards him very obediently. This time, even Lu Chen was a little surprised. He didn't expect this stupid dog to be so obedient today. Originally, he thought that this time, it would probably take a long time to trick this big dog to come back. He didn't expect that with such a casual talk, Atsu would actually come back. Atsu swam all the way back to the shore, and then jumped onto the shore. Before Lu Chen could walk away, the big black dog's whole body shook violently. Suddenly, water splashed like rain, drifted in the air, and then fell with a pitter-patter. Lu Chen jumped away, glared at the stupid dog, and then turned to walk forward. Very quickly, he saw the grave that was piled up on the shore of the dragon lake. Yellow soil and rubble were mixed together, without a tablet or tablet, as if the person inside did not leave a trace in this world. Even her name had been blown away by the wind, never to be seen again. Who would still remember her beauty in the past? That woman who stood under the peach tree facing the wind, with thousands of light pink petals falling like rain, her smile like a flower. Then, like rain and wind, she scattered and scattered, disappearing from the world. Lu Chen stood in front of this nameless grave for a while, and then sat down. He sat next to the grave, looking at the gradually calming dragon lake and the open and clear sky in front of him. The surroundings were very quiet, the world looked very beautiful, and everything seemed so perfect. He was like a good friend that he hadn't met for a long time, sitting side by side, looking at the world, and then he smiled, using his hand to lightly pat the stone beside him, saying, "I've come to see you, Ding Ding. Actually, sometimes I think, if you didn't die back then, what kind of relationship would we have?" Lu Chen looked into the distant sky, as if he was chatting with a beautiful girl who was currently smiling and sitting beside him, quietly listening to him speak. With a trace of a faint smile, he said, "Actually, I thought about many results, and sometimes I thought it was very beautiful. But later on, I gradually realized that I was actually lying to myself." He touched the silent grave and softly said, "If you didn't die, I think the two of us wouldn't have a good ending. Either I let you down, or I harmed you." He smiled, but his smile was a bit bitter, saying, "You see, I was a bit angry at you back then, angry that you didn't want to be infatuated with me and chose someone else. But now that I think about it, not choosing me was actually very good. Although you were also blind, choosing another scum, AI, so you caused your own death. You're such an idiot." At this time, Atsu walked over from the side, curiously circling around Luchin twice, and then sniffing the ground around him, seeming to be a bit interested in the grave beside him. But very quickly, Luchin reached out a hand and hugged its dog head, saying, "This is a very important friend of mine, you must respect her a bit." With its head clamped by Luchin, Atsu did not have any intention of resisting, and instead conveniently laid down, snuggling up to Lu Chen's side. Only when its gaze swept over the pile of yellow soil, it still couldn't help but be curious. Lu Chen shook his head and softly said, "Things of the past, even if I told you, you wouldn't understand, so I won't say it." Woof. On this day, Lu Chen stayed by the Dragon Lake on the Tea Mountain for most of the day. He only came down the mountain when the sky was getting dark and returned to the small pub. As soon as he entered the door, Old Ma came up to him, pulled him in, and then closed the door, saying, "Why are you only back now?" Lu Chen was not bothered and said, "I went up the mountain for a walk and looked at the scenery in the past." "What's wrong?" Old Ma said seriously, "I've already reported your matter, and I used the most secretive and fastest secret channel. Stay here tonight, at most in another 8 to 10 hours, the perfected cultivator might come back with news." Lu Chen was shocked and said, "So fast? That's not possible unless that damned Baldy is near Qingshitang village. Otherwise, from what I know, it would take at least 2 to 3 days for you to pass the news to Fuyunji, right?" Old Ma chuckled and said, "Hee, that's a secret, but I can tell you that as long as I find the perfected cultivator, there is a special supernatural power that is extremely fast." Lu Chen looked at him and suddenly laughed and nodded. "All right, I'll wait here and see what that damned Baldy thinks of me, and if he will like me coming back." Chapter 379. It was already dark, and the mountain village was quiet. Most of the villagers had fallen asleep. Except for the faint starlight in the sky, the village at the foot of Tea Mountain was dark. Only this small tavern still had some inconspicuous light. Lu Chen and Old Ma sat opposite each other and drank. They opened the window and looked at the night sky outside. The cold night wind blew in from outside, causing the candles placed on the table to flicker. It also reflected on their faces, making them look gloomy. Old Ma walked over and closed the window. The howling wind suddenly subsided, and the tavern became quiet. Then he turned to Lu Chen and said with a smile, "In the 10 years we lived here, we often sat here and drank like this in the middle of the night. Now that I think about it, it seems like a long time ago." Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "It has been a long time. I remember that we drank like this many times in the first 3 or 4 years when I first came here. At that time, my mind was unsettled and I was injured. I always felt angry and irritated." Speaking of this, he pondered for a moment, but picked up the wine glass in front of him and raised it to Old Ma. "Thank you." Old Ma sat opposite him and said, "Thank me for thanking me for nothing." Lu Chen said, "Thank you for drinking with me and chatting with me in those days. Even when I scolded you for no reason, you tolerated it. It was not easy." He smiled as if laughing at his old self. Then he raised his glass to Old Ma and drank it in one gulp. Old Ma looked a little relieved. He smiled and nodded. He also picked up his glass and took a sip. Then he said to Lu Chen, "It was so long ago and you still remember it. It's just a small matter, not worth mentioning." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and his face showed a little seriousness. He said to Old Ma, "I have almost no relatives in this world, and the only friend I can talk to is probably you. Therefore, I have always kept these things in mind." Old Ma was startled. He was probably surprised by Lu Chen's words. But very quickly, he lowered his head so that no one could see his expression. After a while, he suddenly raised his head with a smile and said to Lu Chen, "If you really want to repay me, why don't you repay the debts you owed me years ago? Drink." Lu Chen picked up the wine pot on the table and filled Old Ma's cup. He smiled and said, "We haven't seen each other for a long time. Don't mention those unhappy things." Old Ma was speechless. "I have something to ask you," Lu Chen said to Old Ma. Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, go ahead." Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "After the full moon night of the Kunlun party, I escaped from Kunwu City and fled all the way to the end of the world. I have never returned to Mount Kunlun. After I left, how was the situation in Mount Kunlun?" Old Ma looked at him and said, "Do you want to know about the situation of the Kunlun party and Lord Perfected, or do you want to ask about the other people under them?" Lu Chen smiled, and then he said, "I can't hide anything from you. Tell me about it." Old Ma paused for a moment, probably thinking about how to organize his words. After a moment, he said, "The Kunlun party still suffered some damage. The most important thing is, of course, the sudden death of Hakushin Jinkuin, one of the 2 deity transformation stage perfected cultivators in the past. This is a loss that can't be made up for in any case. But no matter what, there is still another deity transformation stage perfected cultivator in the Kunlun party. As long as perfected cultivator Tianlan is there, no one in the world dares to look down on the Kunlun party. So, in general, the Kunlun party hasn't changed much. Life has to go on. Even if one of the legendary spring, summer, autumn, and winter peaks suddenly crashed and destroyed, no more disasters happened to the Kunlun party. But now, on Mount Kunlun, perfected cultivator Tianlan's words are basically the law." Lu Chen frowned and said, "What about the original sect master, perfected cultivator Idle Month? She's in seclusion. She said that she's seriously injured and can't attend to matters." Old Ma's lips curled into a sarcastic smile. He pointed his finger at the sky above Lu Chen's head and said, "I heard that perfected cultivator Idle Month's injury is so serious that she needs at least 10 years of seclusion to recover. So now, even the position of sect master is held by the former first seat of Baichao Tang of the Kunlun party, perfected cultivator Qian Deng." Lu Chen looked at him, and Old Ma also looked at Lu Chen. They looked at each other for a moment, then shook their heads slightly. After a while, Old Ma said again, "As for the rise and fall of power in the Kunlun party, you can probably imagine it. It's nothing more than a change of ruler, a change of courtiers. Now, the disciples originally from Hakushin Jinkuin's faction are suppressed and silent, while the disciples from Baichao Tang or other factions close to perfected cultivator Tianlan are incomparably glorious." Lu Chen suddenly seemed to think of something and said, "The glorious ones are Baichao Tang. Are there other factions close to the Dam Baldi?" At this point, he still hasn't accepted a personal disciple in the sect? Old Ma glanced at him and shook his head. "In fact, a few years ago, I really heard that many people had this idea. In such a big Kunlun party, I don't know how many young talents want to be perfected cultivator Tianlan's disciple, but in the end, he declined one by one. To this day, he still doesn't have any official disciples." Lu Chen thought for a moment and then said, "The damn Baldi has a bad temper. It seems that he is destined to live alone." Old Ma glared at him and opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he still wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. He could only smile bitterly. Lu Chen also ignored him and said, "Don't just talk about the damn Baldi. Is there any news about other people?" Old Ma snorted and said, "Boy, just say it directly. Who do you want to ask about? Otherwise, how would I know what to say?" Lu Chen's fingers rubbed the wine glass for a moment, then he smiled and said, "It's none other than those I know. You know, just tell me." Old Ma was silent for a moment and said, "In recent years, perfected cultivator Tianlan has focused on cultivating the new talented disciples in the sect and doesn't have too many sectarian views. Therefore, the original talented people in the Kunlun party have become more brilliant, and there are also a few new people who have risen later. Su Qingjun is the most famous one. Her cultivation is brave and vigorous. Together with He, she is known as the most outstanding disciple of the next generation of the Kunlun party. In Kunwa City, the Su family is also becoming more and more famous. Lu Chen looked at the wine glass in front of him in silence. After a long time, he nodded and said, "Yes, she's not bad. Based on my understanding of her, she should have achieved such achievements." Old Ma said indifferently, "These years, the Su family has spent a lot of money to search for the murderer who killed their young master." Lu Chen raised his head and looked at him. After a moment, he suddenly smiled. Old Ma said, "So, boy, it's right that you didn't go back to Kunlun Mountain first. If you go back, you will definitely be discovered, and then what awaits you is the scene of the righteous and devil sects hunting you down in the past." Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about it. This kind of thing will be controlled by that damned Baldy." After a pause, he asked again, "What about the others?" Old Ma said, "Who do you want to ask? How is that little girl, White Lotus?" "Oh, her? She seems to be living a good life. I heard that she has always stayed by perfected cultivator Tianlan and has never left." Lu Chen's eyes suddenly flashed. He looked up and said in a deep voice, "Damned Baldy wants to take White Lotus as his disciple?" Chapter 380. Old Ma was stunned for a moment, then he shook his head and said, "I haven't heard of that. I don't think so." Lu Chen looked at him for a while, then nodded and said nothing more. Old Ma looked at the night outside the window and asked casually, "By the way, I've always wanted to ask you something. What happened to the black dog? I remember that you took it away and I don't know where it went. What happened to it now?" Lu Chen was a little surprised, and a smile appeared on his face. He said, "You still remember Atsu?" "Of course, how could I not remember?" Old Ma said with a smile, "That dog can eat very, very much." Lu Chen said with a smile, "It still follows me, but there have been some changes in the past few years. It has grown a lot. I'm afraid that bringing it into this village will scare other people, so I let it wait outside." Old Ma was a little surprised and said, "Atsu actually follows you. That's not bad. Bring it over and let me have a look. I haven't seen it for a few years, and I kind of want to see it." Lu Chen nodded with a smile and said, "No problem. I'll go and have a look later." The two chatted in the tavern, drinking and talking about the past. A long time passed unknowingly. In the dead of night, Old Ma suddenly got up and left the tavern. After about half an hour, he came back and went straight to Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked at him and said, "What's wrong?" There was a smile on Old Ma's face. He seemed to be in a good mood. He said joyfully, "I have received a reply from Lord Perfected Immortal. He is very happy and wants to see you very much. However, he is now in the Divine City and has too many trivial matters to deal with. He really can't leave, so he asked me to take you to the Divine City to meet him." "Going to Immortal City?" Lu Chen murmured. Old Ma said with a smile, "It's not like you haven't been to that place before. Why don't you dare to go?" "That's not it." Lu Chen sighed with emotion. He smiled with a complicated expression and said, "That's a good place." Lu Chen did not ask Old Ma how he could contact Immortal Tianlan from such a long distance in only a few hours. This should be a secret that only Old Ma knew. However, after deciding to return to the Immortal City, Old Ma quickly began to prepare. After daybreak, he had already prepared everything that he needed to bring. On the other hand, Lu Chen had been sitting there leisurely from the beginning to the end, even though he looked empty, as if he had brought nothing with him. Old Ma was a little confused, so he asked Lu Chen, "Where's your luggage?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "I'm used to wandering around alone, so I don't usually bring too many things." Old Ma did not seem to believe what he said, but Lu Chen did not wait for him to think too much. He dragged him out and said, "Let's go, I'll bring you to see Atsu." Old Ma looked at him, nodded, and did not say anything else. The two of them walked out of Qingshatang village when there were not many people in the morning. The official road outside the village stretched forward. The two of them walked on the road, and before long, without Lu Chen calling out to anything, they saw a black shadow jump out of a nearby hill and run towards them. The shadow got closer and closer, and its body grew larger and larger. Old Ma was a little surprised at first, but after hearing the dog barking and seeing Lu Chen's calm look, he immediately reacted and said to Lu Chen in surprise, "Atsu?" "Yes, that's it." Lu Chen nodded. "Good fella." Old Ma's eyes were a little dazed as he saw the huge dog suddenly running towards them. Just by looking at its body, it was a little taller than both of them. Those ordinary beasts such as tigers and lions were simply like little kittens in front of this black dog. At this moment, Atsu also saw Old Ma, who was standing beside Lu Chen. It squinted its eyes, but it did not seem to have much of a reaction. Old Ma was a little annoyed and complained to Lu Chen, "This fella is a little heartless. Back then, in Kunwa City at the foot of Mount Kunlun, you left it with me. I took care of it with all my might and never neglected its food and drink. I didn't expect that in just a few years, this dog would no longer recognize me." Lu Chen laughed and casually pushed Old Ma's shoulder. He jokingly scolded, "You're actually arguing with an animal?" Old Ma mumbled, "Anyway, that's the logic. It's a pity that I had so many meat bones back then." Although it was complaining, it seemed like Atsu really did not remember Old Ma. Or perhaps it was because they had not met for a long time that this dog had forgotten most of its memories of Old Ma. In short, it was very cold. After complaining to Lu Chen for a while, Old Ma of course did not really care about it. In the afternoon, they passed by Nansong Mountain. There was a cultivation sect on that mountain, which was the Thousand Autumn sect that had been controlling Qingshateng village for so many years. Within a radius of tens of miles, apart from the occasional cultivators from other sects that passed by, the Thousand Autumn sect was basically the ruler of this land. Looking at Nansong Mountain from afar, one could see the pavilions and pavilions. White clouds floated in the air, and it did indeed look like a fairy. Lu Chen glanced at the mountain and asked Old Ma, "How's the Thousand Autumn sect doing lately? Are they still doing that shady business of cheating people of their spirit stones?" Old Ma shrugged. "They've never stopped." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Chen. A strange light flashed in the depths of his eyes, but he still wore a smile on his face. He asked casually, "Why, you don't like them?" Lu Chen looked at the beautiful scenery on the mountain in the distance. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't really like what this sect does, but I'm afraid that most of the cultivation clans in the world are doing this, so I have nothing more to say." Old Ma laughed and nodded at Lu Chen. Then, the two of them walked side by side. Black Dog, who was standing behind them, looked up at the mountain. "By the way, did I tell you something else?" Old Ma seemed to have suddenly remembered something. He pulled Lu Chen aside and said, "I heard that in Immortal City nowadays, dogs are not allowed to be kept, or openly bring all kinds of pets on the streets. So, it's hard to say whether Atsu can follow you into the city." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. Then, he said in surprise, "What kind of rule is that? I don't remember hearing about it before." Old Ma smiled and said, "You really don't know. This happened just half a year ago. At that time, Immortal Tiehu, one of the 6 immortals of the Alliance of True Immortals, suddenly opened his mouth and ordered that dogs were not allowed to be kept in the Immortal City. He even sent people to search the streets and killed countless dogs in a month." As he spoke, he turned to look at Black Dog and said, "This dog of yours is frighteningly big. I'm afraid that no matter what, it will offend the guards of True Lord Tiehu. When it gets slaughtered and stewed, don't blame me for reminding you." Lu Chen nodded slowly and responded. Then, he smiled and said, "It seems that True Lord Tiehu has a lot of ideas. Even the Heavenly Law Hall doesn't seem to be enough to satisfy him. But to kill dogs in the city like this, no one came out to persuade him? Who would persuade him to do such a thing?" Old Ma sneered. Lu Chen also laughed. Then, he looked at the road in the direction of Immortal City in the distance. He wondered what he would encounter this time in Immortal City, which was known as the largest city in the vast land of the Divine Land. A true Lord of Deity stage who likes to kill dogs? Lu Chen thought to himself. Chapter 381. Huashan perfected cultivators were high and mighty figures in the cultivation world of the human race. They were revered by all. Every Huashan perfected cultivator's status was similar to that of a demigod. And in the Immortal City, or in the world's most powerful Xianxia, the 6 Huashan perfected cultivators could be said to be the most powerful figures. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were directly in charge of the life and death of all living beings. Since the status of Huashan perfected cultivators was so high, they naturally would not pay attention to some insignificant matters. Moreover, these perfected cultivators all had a large group of people following them. Naturally, there would be a large group of people helping them. Therefore, this was the first time in many years that Lu Chen had heard that a Huashan perfected cultivator would actually pay attention to the problem of whether there were many dogs in the immortal city. It was a bit like a legendary dragon suddenly paying attention to an insignificant ant in the dust at its feet. This Tiehu perfected cultivator is a bit interesting. Lu Chen said to Old Ma as they hurried along. Have you seen him? Old Ma shook his head and said, I haven't seen him. The 6 perfected cultivators in the Immortal Alliance are all high and mighty figures. Other than this one from our own family, I don't have the qualifications or the opportunity to see them. It's just a meeting. How can it be considered an opportunity? Lu Chen said disapprovingly. Then he pondered for a moment and said, but if there really is such a ban, it will be a bit troublesome. It won't be easy for Atsu to follow me into the city. Atu, who was following beside him, seemed to understand a little, and its large dog head came over to take a look. Lu Chen smiled at it and rubbed its head, saying, It's all right, if worst comes to worst, you can just wait for me outside the city. And it's not impossible. Wait for me to think of a way. Maybe I can bring you into the city. Then he glanced at Old Ma and said, According to what you said, there is not a single dog in such a large territory in the immortal city? Old Ma immediately shook his head and said, Of course not. There were hundreds of millions of people in the immortal city. Even if it was impossible for everyone to have a dog, there were still many dog lovers. After Tai Hu True Monarch's dog prohibition order was issued, many dogs were indeed hunted and killed. All kinds of dogs on the streets of Immortal City also disappeared for a while, but there are definitely still many dogs left in the city. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly, looking a little curious. Smiling, he said, Seems like the Immortal City is indeed a place with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. There's actually someone who dares to ignore the ban of a soul formation perfected lord. And from what you said, it seems like there are quite a number of such people? Old Ma thought for a while and said, Not necessarily. After all, he is a perfected cultivator. Everyone has to be careful. But in the Immortal City, there are still quite a few people who still keep dogs. It's just that everyone is a little more restrained and no longer swagger their dogs on the streets like before. They keep them at home? Yes, they usually keep them at home and occasionally bring them out for a stroll. They just have to be careful. After all, the people who still keep dogs now have some status. Those guards who kill and ban dogs in the city mostly turn a blind eye when they see them. Lu Chen nodded and asked again, Then the dogs that were killed in the past? Old Ma sneered and said, Of course it's the dogs of those commoners. Oh, there were indeed quite a few wild dogs in the Immortal City, so they were all killed. In the past, there would often be incidents of mad dogs biting people in the Immortal City. You know, in that kind of place, it's very easy to have mixed blood wild dogs and the like. Every year, there are actually quite a number of people who are bitten to death by mad dogs. But after Tai Hu True Monarch's ban was issued, the situation became much better. Then it seems that this ban is not completely without its benefits. Lu Chen said with some surprise. Old Ma laughed and said, You can say that. But this matter, we small characters and commoners take it seriously. People like Lord True Monarch definitely don't care about it. Maybe he will just casually give an order and then be too lazy to care. I heard that the people who carry out this ban under Tai Hu True Monarch have done some unbearable things and caused a lot of public anger. What do you mean? Lu Chen looked a little curious. Old Ma laughed and said, What else can it be? It's nothing more than those tricks of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, and bullying the kind. These people don't dare to provoke the rich and influential families, but when it comes to bullying the commoners, they don't hesitate to come and catch the dogs. At the same time, there are also extortion and blackmail. I haven't been in the Immortal City these days, But I heard that because of this ban, there is a foul atmosphere and the people are boiling with anger. Lucian frowned and said, "So bad? That Tai Hu True Monarch doesn't know about it?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "Lord True Monarch is a high and mighty person. Who knows how many things he has to do every day? He won't pay attention to such a small matter." Lu Chen's eyes flashed, and after a moment he suddenly said, "I don't know about the people under Tai Hu True Monarch, but the dead Baldy has a large number of people under him, especially Fuyunji, such as Sinister and Cunning Hall. He definitely knows about it, right?" Old Ma coughed and didn't say anything. Lu Chen snorted and revealed an as expected expression. Then he shook his head and didn't say anything. Along the way, with this incident of dog ban mentioned by Old Ma unintentionally, Lu Chen asked Old Ma some things about Tai Hu True Monarch without batting an eyelid, as if it was incidentally. According to Old Ma, Tai Hu True Monarch was a highly respected big shot who was a little older than Tian Lan True Monarch. But for Lu Chen, this answer was meaningless, because first of all Huashan True Monarchs were highly respected. If they didn't admit this, they probably couldn't stay in Zhengxianmeng or the Immortal City any longer. In addition, the dead Baldy Tian Lan was indeed a rare genius. Among the 6 true monarchs in Zhengxianmeng, he was the youngest one. In other words, all the Huashan true monarchs were older than the dead Baldy. After being despised and questioned by Lu Chen, Old Ma had to search his memory again and told Lu Chen some things about Tai Hu True Monarch that he could think of in his daily life. In this way, it seemed that a more complete image of a Huashan True Monarch gradually became clear in front of Lu Chen. Needless to say, Tai Hu True Monarch was born in a famous cultivation sect, Tianluo True Monarch. In addition, this true monarch had a serious and cautious temperament. For many years he had always been fair, so he was in charge of the Hall of Heavenly Law, which was in charge of law and punishment in Zhengxianmeng. He was impartial and had always been respected by the world. Behind this true monarch was a rich and powerful family, and he also had several proud disciples, all of whom were outstanding geniuses in Tianluo sect. Under his command, the Hall of Heavenly Law had a very strong guard, which was said to be among the top 3 in the ranking of the various mountains in Zhengxianmeng. In short, he was basically an incomparably strong and superior big shot. In addition, at the last moment, Old Ma said to Lu Chen calmly, "Well, I heard that this lord doesn't like our boss, Tian Lan True Monarch. They are like fire and water." Chapter 382. Pausa. These two are both spirit-severing true monarchs, and they're both in Zhengxianmeng. How could their relationship be so bad? Lu Chen asked in surprise. Old Ma thought for a while and said, "I only know a little about the ins and outs of this matter. There are many things that only these two lords know. But as far as I know, Tai Hu True Monarch has been dissatisfied with Fuyunji for a long time. He often publicly said that our hall is a waste of money and is useless. Even Hall Master Shui Ying has been criticized by him several times." Lu Chen nodded and revealed a trace of a smile on his face and said, "Shui Ying must be very depressed, right? Isn't that so?" Old Ma laughed and said, "With Hall Master Shui Ying's identity, she can actually be considered a big shot in the Immortal City. Ordinary people don't dare to provoke her. But Tai Hu True Monarch is not an ordinary person. And he is probably one of the few humans in the Immortal City that Hall Master Shui Ying doesn't dare to provoke." "Damn Baldy didn't stand up for his subordinates?" Lu Chen asked. Old Ma hesitated for a while and said, "This matter is actually not easy to handle. Tai Hu True Monarch only said a few words, and didn't really make a move or suppress them. Then with his identity, even our true monarch can't say much. After all, in terms of seniority, Tai Hu True Monarch is a bit older." Speaking up to here, Old Ma sighed again and said, "But then again, these few years in Fuyunji has not been very smooth. Many things have gone wrong, and people have seen them as a joke. In addition, the remnants of the devil sect are sinister and cunning. They are really hard to deal with. Those who don't know the inside story will often ridicule them." Lu Chen was silent for a while, and suddenly sneered and said, "Ordinary people might be like this, But how can people who have reached the position of true monarch not know the inside story of this kind of thing? In my opinion, that's Supreme Tai who most likely has other plans in his heart. Old Ma was stunned for a moment, then he nodded and said hesitantly, "Now that you mention it, it seems to make sense. When you reach the Immortal City and see Lord True Monarch, you might as well mention this to him." Lu Chen looked at him with a smile and shook his head. Although this damned Baldy is sinister and cunning, with a belly full of evil tricks, in all these years, I've never seen anyone more powerful than him in both the righteous and evil Dao. So I think he probably knows about this kind of thing in his heart, he just doesn't want to say it. Old Ma laughed and nodded. That makes sense. I didn't expect you to think so highly of Immortal even though you are usually dissatisfied with him. Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said grumpily, "Nonsense. Who in this world would look down on a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator? He's either a lunatic or a fool." Of course, Lu Chen and Old Ma were neither lunatics nor fools, so they quickly reached an agreement on this matter. At the same time, Lu Chen also casually asked Old Ma about the current situation in the Immortal City and Xianxia. Old Ma also told him everything honestly. It seemed that he did not hide anything from him. Although he was currently living in seclusion in the remote mountain village of Qingshatang village, and no one knew how long he had stayed here before Lu Chen appeared, but from the conversation between Lu Chen and Old Ma, it was obvious that this fatty Old Ma seemed to be very familiar with Xianxia, including the various forces and factions in the Immortal City, as well as the various undercurrents surging under the water surface. It was obvious that he was a person who had immersed himself in the Immortal City and Xianxia for a long time. Because of this, Lu Chen actually had a preliminary understanding of the various forces in Xianxia and Immortal City just by listening to Old Ma's narration during the past few days of travel. But in the end, he still said to Old Ma very seriously, "Now I've memorized most of the things you said, so I have an idea of what to do. But right now, I have two more important things to ask you." Old Ma smiled and said, "Ask away, I'll tell you everything I know. Don't worry." Lu Chen stretched out a finger and said, "First, although the damn Baldy didn't sit on the throne of the Kunlun Party's leader, his position in the Kunlun Party is almost unparalleled. It can be said that he has control of this famous cultivation sect, right?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Of course. Now, from the top to the bottom of the Kunlun Party, the only perfected cultivator in the soul formation stage can be said to be respected as a god." Lu Chen said faintly, "If that's the case, I find it strange. Why didn't the damn Baldy stay in the Kunlun Mountain and be a local tyrant? Instead, he insisted on coming to Immortal City to be squeezed by people. Maybe there's something dangerous." Old Ma frowned, hesitated for a moment, and said, "In fact, it's not just what you said. After the master completely controlled the Kunlun Party, he began to gradually summon the talents of the Kunlun Party, including those Yuanying Jinren with profound cultivation, to Immortal City. Of course, on the surface, he said that he had too many relatives and friends, but in the end, many of these people were still placed under his sect. Well, there are no personal disciples, everyone is a registered disciple." Speaking of this, his eyes looked at Lu Chen with deep meaning, but Lu Chen didn't seem to notice Old Ma's eyes for a while, or maybe he didn't want to be entangled in this kind of thing at all. At this moment, his attention was completely fixed on another thing, and he looked extraordinarily focused. Lu Chen looked around and suddenly said, "You mean, many of the young outstanding disciples of the Kunlun Party have come to Immortal City?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, and these people basically only know how to respect him. Although Zheng Xianming's intention is to incorporate these people into Fuyunji, now is probably not the time." Lu Chen snorted and said, "Using public resources for private purposes, this can be considered as using Zheng Xianming's money to cultivate their own children." Old Ma smiled and said, "Isn't that so? But probably because of this, after Tiehu Zheng Xianming, who is in charge of Heavenly Law Hall, knew about this, he flew into a rage. His subordinates also suddenly became excited and began to stir up trouble. Once, they even took away a few people from Fuyunji, humiliated them by the river outside the city, and then ran away without leaving their names. Lu Chen glanced at him and felt that it was a little funny, and said, since they didn't leave their names, why do you think that it was done by Tiehu Xinxiang's subordinates? Old Ma shrugged and said, when you stay in Immortal City for a long time, you will probably be familiar with the rules here. Lu Chen didn't care, and just brushed over this issue and didn't talk about it anymore. Now he wanted to talk about another matter. There is one more thing, Old Ma. Say it. Old Ma replied. Over the past few days, I've heard about the true Immortal Alliance along the way. They're really worshipping them as if they're gods. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the Immortal City who are itching to make a move. But these are none of my business. I just want to ask you, what did the damn Baldy tell you? Such a long journey, he wouldn't really let only the two of us finish it, right? Old Ma was startled for a moment, then nodded and said, you really know Xianxia angrily. In fact, after knowing our decision to return to Immortal City, Xianxia angrily thought about us, and specially arranged people to protect us. Who is it? Lu Chen asked curiously. For some reason, Old Ma's expression looked a little subtle. After a while, he was heard coughing and said, I heard that it is White Lotus. Chapter 383. Her again. Lu Chen was obviously startled. After a moment of silence, he said to Old Ma with a strange expression on his face, if I remember correctly, White Lotus should be the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuin in the past, right? That damn Baldy actually treats her differently. It really doesn't seem like his character. Old Ma shrugged and said, who knows? That little girl's identity has long been made public, at least in the Kunlun party, everyone knows about it. But don't think too much about it. Although Perfected Immortal has always kept White Lotus by his side for the past few years, he has never officially announced that he wants to accept her as a disciple. Lu Chen shook his head, his face calm, and said, I won't think too much about it. I don't care who that damn Baldy wants to accept as a disciple. I just feel a little strange that he would actually keep Hakushin Jinkuin's disciple by his side. Old Ma smiled and said, when I first heard about this, I actually felt a little strange in my heart, but Perfected Immortal's heart is as deep as the sea, and his plans are far-reaching. It's not a big deal that I can't see through it. Lu Chen didn't immediately respond to him, but just walked forward in silence for a while. After a while, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, I have a guess about what that damn Baldy is thinking. Do you want to hear it? Old Ma's body paused, and he turned to look at Lu Chen, only to see that Lu Chen had a gentle smile on his face. Old Ma looked at him for a while and then said, I don't want to hear it. After saying that, he continued to walk forward, leaving Lu Chen standing in the same place. Lu Chen's face finally revealed a trace of astonishment, but then he laughed and sped up his pace to catch up with Old Ma. Walking side by side with Old Ma, Lu Chen said with a smile, damn fatty, I haven't seen you for a few years, but you look a lot smarter. But Old Ma spat at him, then sneered, the superior is respected. Those who dare to pry into the private affairs of the venerable, especially those in our line of work, never live long. I'm still young. I don't want to die early. After that, Old Ma continued to walk forward without looking back. It seemed that he regarded Lu Chen as a snake or a scorpion. Lu Chen, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind and even laughed. He caught up with him in a few steps and said with a smile, that damned Baldy still thinks highly of you. What are you afraid of? Bullshit. Old Ma looked very annoyed and said grumpily, no matter what, I'm just a subordinate who runs errands for the immortal. It's our duty to abide by the rules and not overstep them. On the contrary, you are the one who has a close relationship with the immortal. You can say whatever you want, but I don't want to touch it at all. Lu Chen looked at him and said with emotion, nowadays, even you have become so smart. It's really hard to mix in the underworld of cultivation. Old Ma ignored him and just walked forward with his head down. Lu Chen stretched and said, how about this, I'll say a few words to myself now. Just let it go in one ear and out the other. After all, we have a good relationship. Old Ma remained silent, as if he had completely covered up Lu Chen's voice. However, Lu Chen could still clearly see through some slight movements of Old Ma's body that this guy was secretly stretching his ears to listen carefully. Lu Chen didn't care. He coughed and said after a moment of silence, "Based on my understanding of that damned Baldy, if the infighting in the Kunlun party was really just a fight between him and Hakushin Jinkuin, then now he would never take care of Hakushin Jinkuin's disciples." Lu Chen nodded to the expressionless old ma next to him, and then said very clearly, "He is not the kind of person who is magnanimous. In the past, when someone angered him, it would have been fine if it was an ordinary mortal, because that damned Baldy couldn't afford to find trouble with mortals. But if it was a cultivator who angered him, the result was usually not good." Old Ma coughed and said, "Now, Lord Perfected Immortal has already cultivated his moral character, and his temper has become very good. Those things in the past will not happen again." Lu Chen sneered, obviously not believing what Old Ma said, and then said to himself, "Because of this damned Baldy actually showed great kindness this time. There's something wrong." "What's wrong?" Old Ma couldn't help but ask. "He must be buying people's hearts." Lu Chen said seriously, "After that damned Baldy defeated Hakushin Jinkuin and took control of the Kunlun party, there must be many people watching what he did, and they must be anxious. But as long as this news gets out, probably everyone will think that if this perfected immortal Tianlon can even take care of his senior brother's last disciple, isn't this very righteous?" Old Ma coughed, and then said seriously, "Lord Perfected Immortal is really righteous, but this matter actually has nothing to do with that little girl named White Lotus, right?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "In addition to buying people's hearts, that damned Baldy kept White Lotus by his side to cultivate. There is probably one more important reason." Old Ma couldn't help but be curious and asked, "What is it?" "She is a 5-pillar genius." Lu Chen smiled, but when the smile was reflected in Old Ma's eyes, it seemed to be a little cold at that moment, and in his ears, Lu Chen's voice continued to echo, "Such a genius is rarely seen in 1,000 years, and even if there is one, she may not be able to enter the Kunlun mountain. How could that damned Baldy give up such a chance?" He smiled, looking very happy and gratified, and said to Old Ma with a smile, "Don't you think so?" Old Ma was in a daze for a while, and suddenly turned around and strode forward, muttering at the same time, "What a mess, I'm confused." Lu Chen and Old Ma met White Lotus on the 4th day after they went out. On that day, the sky was a little gloomy, and it was almost dusk. Even Atsu, who was following them, looked a little sleepy. Lu Chen discussed with Old Ma to find a place to rest first, and then continue their journey the next morning. While they were chatting, Atsu, who was originally lying at Lu Chen's feet, suddenly quivered, and then its ears pricked up, it opened its eyes, and looked forward. Lu Chen and Old Ma seemed to feel that something was wrong at this moment, and then they saw the last ray of sunset in front of them. The pale golden light sprinkled on the ground, and the leaves and weeds on both sides of the road seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light, shining beautifully and admirable. A girl in white appeared on the road in front of them, looking in Lu Chen's direction with a frosty expression. Lu Chen's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he was also filled with emotions. He thought that if it wasn't for the bad luck, this girl in front of him might have fallen into the barbarian wasteland in the south with him. However, it was a little boring to think about these things now, so Lu Chen smiled and waved at White Lotus. White Lotus looked at him, and then at Old Ma, and finally slowly looked down, and saw the big black dog lying next to Lu Chen. A huge black dog, which looked more like a demon beast than a domestic black dog, was lying there, and looked like it was about to fall asleep. White Lotus suddenly shouted, "Stupid dog, how long has it been, and you already don't recognize me?" Atsu's body suddenly trembled, and then it slowly raised its head, looking at the girl in white in front of it. After a moment, Atsu suddenly let out a whine, and a trace of fear appeared on its face. Chapter 384. There was a hint of surprise in Old Ma's eyes as he looked at White Lotus in front of him. He did not notice the abnormality of Atsu next to him. However, Lu Chen was different from him. He had been with this black dog almost every day for the past few years, so he noticed the abnormality of Atsu almost immediately. He could not help but frown. After Atsu's breakthrough a few years ago, Lu Chen rarely saw this kind of fear in him. Even when he ventured into the depths of the southern lands with Lu Chen in the future, Atu was still carefree, roaming the world with ease. However, on this day when Atsu saw White Lotus, it suddenly showed this kind of abnormal emotion, which surprised Lu Chen. Perhaps Atsu still remembered the encounter in Kunlun Mountain? A figure walked up from behind and stood in front of Atsu, blocking Atsu's sight. It was Lu Chen. He reached out his hand and touched Atsu's head. Atsu seemed to feel something and looked at him. The fear in its eyes quickly dissipated, and it became clear and calm again. Whether it was Lu Chen's hand or Atsu's fur, they were both warm. Lu Chen smiled and nodded to Atsu, then turned around and looked at White Lotus. After a few years, White Lotus was no longer the child she used to be. Today, she was still delicate and beautiful, and her temperament was still pure and cold. She still gave people the feeling of an ice fairy. But it was undeniable that this girl was approaching, or should it be said that she was about to enter the most beautiful, brilliant, and dazzling youth of her life. Her body had grown a lot taller, and she looked more and more slender. Her figure was gradually revealed, making people's eyes light up. It was as if this girl was born with a dazzling light that made people unable to ignore her, and subconsciously wanted to take a few more glances at her. Lu Chen nodded to her, showed a smile, and said, "Long time no see." White Lotus's gaze fell on him, and there was a trace of hidden and very complicated expression in the depths of her eyes. When she was about to speak, suddenly all three people present heard a roar from behind Lu Chen. It was Atsu who poked its head out from behind Lu Chen. But this time, the instinctive fear that Atsu showed when it saw White Lotus had completely disappeared. Instead, this big black dog seemed to be very annoyed. It bared its teeth and growled at White Lotus, and even showed its fangs. It looked very angry, as if it couldn't wait to pounce on this beautiful girl to vent its anger. White Lotus probably didn't expect Atsu's expression and attitude to change so suddenly. She was stunned and said to Lu Chen, "What's wrong with you, stupid dog?" Lu Chen reached out and stroked Atsu's head. After thinking for a while, he said, "Probably angry out of shame." White Lotus, holy beasts were powerful monsters. After advancing, they almost had no natural enemies, and there were not many enemies in the world that they were afraid of. Therefore, the sudden fear just now made Atsu very angry and annoyed. It felt that there was no need for it to be afraid of White Lotus at all. It felt that it had embarrassed itself. Therefore, for the rest of the journey, this big black dog no longer had a good attitude towards the beautiful girl, White Lotus. However, humans were heartless. None of the three people present would run to comfort this suddenly angry black dog. At most, Lu Chen gently stroked its head a few times. At the same time, his attention was still on White Lotus. "Why are you here?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus shrugged and said, "I was ordered to come here." As she said that, she turned to face Old Ma and took out a sealed envelope from her arms. She asked Old Ma, "Are you Ma Xiaoyun?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes." As he said that, he took out a piece of jade from his arms and handed it to White Lotus. White Lotus took it and looked at it carefully. Then, she nodded and handed it to Old Ma along with the envelope in her hand. Old Ma took the jade and put it away first. Then, he directly opened the envelope and read the letter inside carefully. Then, he nodded and said, "That's right. But in the letter, Lord Perfected Immortal ordered me to go with Lu Chen to the Immortal City. I will go with you." White Lotus grunted and did not seem to care. Her clear and lively eyes looked at Lu Chen and said, "Let's go." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Okay, let's go." "How have you been these few years?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus said, "It's not bad. My biggest backer, Master, died, and in the end, I found an even more powerful Uncle Master. I don't know how many people inside and outside the sect are envious of me." As she said that, she smiled at Lu Chen and said, "What about you?" "I'm quite unlucky." Lu Chen said honestly, "After you left, Atsu and I also went south to escape into the depths of the land of chaos. Our days were miserable and we only came back recently." White Lotus looked like she didn't believe it. She pointed at Atsu and said, "You must be talking nonsense. This stupid dog is 10 times fatter than before. How can it look like it's living a miserable life? This is obviously the appearance of a well-fed dog. Roar! Atsu let out a low growl and extended its fangs. It looked like it was trying to bite off White Lotus's white and delicate finger. White Lotus giggled as she retracted her finger. She didn't seem angry at all. She said to Lu Chen, "This dog's temper has grown. I don't remember it being this angry when it was with you." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Atsu is not like this usually. It is probably in a bad mood today." White Lotus thought about it and nodded without saying anything. Lu Chen changed the topic and at the same time, he asked about the doubts in his heart. He said, "What about you? What's the situation now? It seems like you are doing very well in the Kunlun party. Even that true Lord Tianlan treats you differently." White Lotus curled her lips and said, "It's just a There is nothing to boast about." Lu Chen asked, "Shouldn't you be on the Kunlun mountain in the Westland? Why did you come to the Immortal City and were sent to pick me up?" White Lotus said, "My martial uncle Tianlan insisted that I follow him, and then he suddenly told me to come to pick you up not long ago." Speaking of this, White Lotus suddenly smiled and said, "But I really did not expect that the person who can make a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm miss you and make me come to pick you up in person is actually you." Lu Chen said with a smile, "That's really hard for you." White Lotus looked into his eyes, but there was no smile in her eyes. After staring at Lu Chen for a long time, she suddenly said, "Who are you?" Lu Chen said, "I'm a former handyman disciple of the Kunlun party. You can't have forgotten this, can you?" White Lotus snorted and said, "What kind of handyman disciple can make a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm remember him and send someone to pick him up? There must be an important reason for him to think so highly of someone." Lu Chen smiled and said nothing. He just walked forward with Atsu. After a while, suddenly, White Lotus's voice sounded a little cold. She said, "Lu Chen, were you a spy that perfected cultivator Tianlan personally placed in the Kunlun party to inquire about information in the Kunlun mountain and do a lot of evil things? For example, my master and my eldest brother." Lu Chen's expression did not change. He still looked gentle and polite. He smiled at White Lotus and said, "No, I don't know the person you are talking about, so these things have nothing to do with me." "Really?" White Lotus looked a little suspicious. "Really?" Lu Chen said with a smile and a nod. He looked very relaxed and there was no trace of lying. Chapter 385. What do you think of White Lotus as a person? This was the first question Lu Chen asked Old Ma when they chatted privately that night after they rested for the night. Because of safety concerns, they did not enter the cities and towns along the way, but directly slept in the wild. Fortunately, sleeping in the wild was not difficult for cultivators like them. At night, because of the difference between men and women, and because White Lotus was also a neat freak, or because she was not used to being too close to others, she hid far away and slept. Old Ma glanced at White Lotus in the distance. After making sure that she could not eavesdrop on his conversation with Lu Chen, he lowered his voice and said, "It's okay. At least on the surface, she is good to us. As for more, this is the first day we met, so we can't see it." Lu Chen nodded slowly. After a moment, he said, "Didn't she say that the damn Baldy always kept her by his side? Why did he let her come out alone to pick us up this time?" Old Ma shrugged and moved his fat body lying on the ground to make himself more comfortable. At the same time, he said, "No one knows. I think that besides Lord Immortal and White Lotus herself, there is probably no third person who can completely understand the relationship between them. However, since you asked this, I think that this time White Lotus came to pick us up, at least two things are clear." Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and moved closer to Old Ma. He asked with interest, "Oh? What two things? Tell me." Old Ma said lightly, "First, Lord Immortal believes in her. Or it can be said that he has great confidence that White Lotus will not betray him, so he can let her come out alone to pick us up. Second, Lord Immortal values you very much, but he only secretly sent White Lotus for such an important matter. This means that this girl's cultivation is absolutely not what it used to be, and her strength must be abnormally strong. That is why Lord Immortal trusts her so much." Lu Chen was deep in thought. Old Ma looked at him and said with some bad intentions, "What, are you afraid? In the past, Lord Immortal valued you so much, but you did not pay attention to him. Now that such a genius has suddenly appeared out of nowhere, do you know to be nervous?" Lu Chen also laughed, shook his head, and looked at White Lotus in the distance. He saw that the girl was sleeping with her clothes on, and seemed to have fallen asleep. He was silent for a moment, and said, "Damn Baldy, this person is extremely intelligent, far-sighted, and sophisticated. He is close to a demigod, but not like a human, so it is very difficult to use ordinary people's point of view to guess him. In my opinion, at least in the current world, there is no one that he deeply trusts. This White Lotus is also the same. She is not qualified." Old Ma did not seem to agree with Lu Chen's words. He sneered and said, "Look at what you said as if it is true. Then tell me, in the end, how can one be considered as Lord Immortal's considerate person?" Lu Chen said indifferently, "It's very simple. That damnable Baldy officially takes someone as a disciple and passes down the heaven character Taoist title passed down from generation to that person. That person is someone that he truly regards highly and fosters with all his heart." Tian Taoist name? Old Ma seemed to be stunned for a moment. After a while, he said, "If it is to accept a disciple, White Lotus should be very promising. After all, her talent is too good. She is a rare five-pillar genius. Even Hakushin Jinkuan made an exception and accepted her as his last disciple." Lu Chen sneered and said, "Damn Baldy is not his dead senior brother, let alone him. In short, remember what I said, in the eyes of Damn Baldy, everyone is probably the same as an ant. The most important thing is whether they are useful or not. As for saying that there is hope with him as a five-pillar genius, I don't know if White Lotus believes in this, but that is a lie." As he said this, Lu Chen looked up at the dark sky and slowly said, "What is 5 pillars? It is necessary to use them." The journey was very smooth and there were no accidents. After a few days, they safely arrived at the Yingxing River outside the Immortal City. From afar, they could already see the huge city in the vast and fertile Four Rivers Plain in the distance. The Immortal City was now the well-deserved #1 city in the vast land of the Divine Land. Especially after Zhengxianming settled here 1,000 years ago and put in effort to manage it, until today, the prosperity of the Immortal City increased day by day. It attracted countless talents from aristocratic families and became the center of the land of the vast land. Unlike most of the cities in the vast land of the Divine Land, the Immortal City here, although there was the word city, there were no city walls. Countless buildings and palaces were built on this fertile land, forming a vast city that could not be seen at a glance. Here, people did not need the protection of the city walls, because the Immortal City itself was the most powerful force in the world. The Immortal City was backed by a mountain on one side and water on 3 sides. The 4 most famous rivers in the Four Rivers Plain flowed through this huge city. In the early ancient times, it was said that there was an ancient relic here. Today, in the Immortal City, some remnants of the relic could occasionally be seen in some corners. Among them, the most eye-catching were of course in the east, south, west, and north directions. There was a magnificent giant statue carved with the legendary azure dragon, white tiger, vermilion bird, and black tortoise. These 4 statues of the holy beasts were all standing with their backs facing the distance. Because of the long years, there were many wear and tear, but the boundless aura still remained. Over the years, it gradually became a famous scenery in the city. When outsiders came to the Immortal City to play, most of them would come down here to admire it. But other than that, the legends about the relic had been passed down for many years. There were all kinds of sayings. For example, there were ancient demons under the Immortal City, or treasures of heaven and earth in the depths of the relic, and so on. There were many kinds. However, it was generally accepted that the ruins were extremely dangerous and had caused the deaths of many people. For the sake of safety, several deity transformation stage perfected lords of the previous generation of the true Immortal Alliance cast a spell together to seal all the entrances to the ancient ruins. Since then, there were no more demons or ghosts in the immortal city. Xianxia did his best to manage this place, and also made the immortal city develop with each passing day. Many years later, the immortal city was divided into the upper city and the lower city. The so-called upper city specifically referred to the Azure Dragon district where the Azure Dragon statue was located. This area was located halfway up the Sky Dragon Mountain, and the terrain was at least 100 meters higher than the other districts. It was different from the other districts and had been directly expropriated by Xianxia long ago. Now, almost all the high-level people in Xianxia lived here. In addition, the other 3 districts, namely White Tiger, Vermilion Bird, and Black Tortoise, were all on flat ground. They were inferior to the Azure Dragon district in terms of majesty, but far more prosperous and lively. For many years, hundreds of millions of creatures lived in this big city named Immortal, and spent every day full of hope and surprises. Before we enter the city, I have something to say to you. On the bank of Yingxing River, White Lotus pulled Lu Chen and said to him. Old Ma, who was beside her, also stopped. Lu Chen said, "What is it?" "It's not convenient to bring this dog in," White Lotus pointed at Atsu very calmly. "Recently, someone in the city is killing dogs." "Well," Lu Chen nodded and said, "Old Ma told me about this before, but I don't think it's a big problem. After all, the damn Baldy's identity and status are extraordinary. It's not a big deal to protect a dog." "Woof!" Atsu barked next to him, seeming to be a little happy. White Lotus shook her head and said, "It's not a good idea. It always causes trouble for Martial Uncle Tianlun. You can leave it outside the city. Anyway, when we were in Kunlun Mountain, Atsu also ran around all day. It shouldn't get lost." Lu Chen's face changed slightly, and then he shook his head and said, "No." White Lotus was stunned and said in surprise, "What?" Chapter 386. Lu Chen looked at the immortal city from afar, looking at the almost endless bustling scene of Mount Tianlong. Even though he was far away now, he seemed to be able to feel the hustle and bustle there. There are so many people here. It's hard to count the number of dogs or stray dogs without owners. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for the people under you to give the order to kill dogs, right? White Lotus shrugged and looked indifferent. She said, "Who cares? Anyway, I don't raise dogs. Besides, he is a perfected cultivator in the Huashan realm. He has high cultivation, high status and power. He can do whatever he wants. Why should he care about what your people do?" "Well, what you said is very reasonable." Lu Chen smiled, then turned back to Old Ma and said, "Since it's not good to take Atsu into the city, I won't go in. Go back and tell the damn Baldy to come out to see me, okay?" Old Ma was a little stunned for a moment and didn't know what to say. White Lotus, who was next to him, was also shocked. After a while, she frowned and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? Martial Uncle Tianlun is a person of high status. It's already a great honor for him to see you. How can he condescend to come out of the city to see you?" Lu Chen ignored her. He just looked at Old Ma and said, "Old Ma, you know what's going on. Does he want to see me, or do I want to see him?" Old Ma gave a wry smile and said, "Well, it's him who wants to see you." White Lotus looked unhappy and said, "Even if Martial Uncle Tianlun wants to see you, isn't it a matter of course for you to pay a visit to him given his status?" Lu Chen smiled and reached out to touch Atsu, who was standing next to him. He said, "This time I don't want to follow this matter of course. Go back and tell the damn Baldy that I'll wait here tonight. If I don't come tonight, I'll leave tomorrow." "How dare you?" Before Old Ma could answer, White Lotus had already shouted at him. But then the beautiful girl suddenly rolled her eyes and the original anger suddenly disappeared. She looked at Lu Chen with some suspicion and said, "Who are you? Why are you so fearless in the face of a perfected cultivator in the Huashan realm? Aren't you afraid that the perfected cultivator will be furious and turn you into powder in an instant?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, I'm very scared." After saying that, he turned around and walked towards a small forest not far away. Black Dogatu was about to follow when it suddenly turned around and glared fiercely at Old Ma and White Lotus. It let out a low growl and bared its fangs as it shook its head threateningly. Then, it swung its tail and trotted after Lu Chen. White Lotus was furious and was about to scold him, but she suddenly heard old Ma cry out, "Hey! Atsu, why are you being so fierce to me? It's not like I'm the one who's unhappy with you." White Lotus's words were about to come out of her mouth, but she was choked back by this guy's words. She turned around and glared at old Ma, saying, "How can you say that? This person is disrespectful to the perfected cultivator. Is it wrong for us to scold him?" "That's right." Old Ma immediately replied seriously, then turned around and walked toward the immortal city. At the same time, he said, "Let's go back and pay our respects to the perfected cultivator and ask him to make a decision. It would be best if he could kill this guy in his anger and vent my anger." White Lotus followed him and looked at old Ma suspiciously. She said, "Really? But you seem to be very familiar with this Lu Chen?" Old Ma sneered and shook his head repeatedly. He said, "Miss, you've misunderstood me. This guy has been an eyesore to me for more than 10 years. If I'm lucky enough to meet the perfected cultivator later, you'll see what I say to him." Oh, White Lotus couldn't figure out the relationship between the two men for a while, so she stopped talking and followed old Ma to the immortal city. She occasionally looked back. Lu Chen, who was a little mysterious in her heart, seemed to have become more and more vague now. He was like a vague and indistinguishable shadow in the night. Xianxia was the most powerful cultivation organization among the human clan in the vast land of the Divine Land. In terms of strength alone, it had long surpassed any single cultivation sect in the past. It could even be said that in the history of the human clan, there had never been something like Xianxia. But its strength, at least for now, was an unquestionable fact. Xianxia controlled the immortal city, which was second to none in the world. The 6 perfected cultivators in the Immortal Allies were the supreme leaders of this powerful organization, Xianxia, so they naturally occupied the best things in this city. The Azure Dragon district on the Sky Dragon Mountain was undoubtedly the best place in the immortal city of the 4 major districts marked by the statues of the 4 sacred beasts in the mysterious ruins left behind in the ancient times. The Azure Dragon district on the Sky Dragon Mountain was undoubtedly the best place in the immortal city of the 4 districts marked by the statues of the 4 sacred beasts in the mysterious ruins left behind in the ancient times. The headquarters of Xianxia was located here. The entire Azure Dragon district was the territory of Xianxia, and the 6 perfected cultivators had also taken the best pieces of land here as their residences. Perfected Tianlan once returned to his own sect, the Kunlun Party, a few years ago. Many things happened on the way home, and there were many different opinions, but the final result was still in front of everyone. Whether they accepted it or not, it was the same. After that, Perfected Tianlan stayed on the Kunlun Mountain for more than a year. Although there were many rumors in the outside world that he wanted to settle the hearts of the people in the Kunlun Party and eliminate the dissidents, he did not neglect the affairs of Xianxia, and there were no problems with remote control. After this period of time, Perfected Tianlan once again set out on his journey to the immortal city. However, this time, under the surface of calmness, there were many undercurrents surging in Xianxia. This was because from that time on, many disciples of the Kunlun Party joined Xianxia under various names and began to work for Perfected Tianlan. The Kunlun Party was one of the 5 famous sects in the world, and there were many outstanding talents in the sect. Therefore, gradually, the strength of Perfected Tianlan's sect suddenly increased, and its momentum also became more and more prosperous. Old Ma and White Lotus met Perfected Tianlan at noon that day. The super fatty, who was much fatter than Old Ma and of course much more burly, sat in his cave residence, passing shadow, and listened to what they had to say about Lu Chen. Perfected Tianlan's expression was like an ancient well, without any changes. When he turned to look down, he saw 2 people standing there. White Lotus frowned slightly, and there seemed to be a little anger on her face, while Old Ma looked down, like an old monk in meditation, as if nothing had anything to do with him. Perfected Tianlan shook his head, turned to White Lotus, and smiled. He said gently, "You've worked hard on this journey, go and rest. I'll deal with the rest, so you don't have to worry about it." White Lotus took a step forward and said, "Martial uncle, I think this person named Lu Chen is very strange. What's his background? How dare he be so arrogant and disrespectful to you?" Perfected Tianlan snorted and said, "This guy is rebellious and bold, so I must punish him severely. All right, you can go now." White Lotus wanted to say something but stopped on second thought, and there seemed to be a trace of confusion in her eyes. But in the end, she bowed and left the cave residence. At this time, there were only Perfected Tianlan and Old Ma left in the cave residence. They looked at each other, and Perfected Tianlan suddenly said, "What did that brat say?" Old Ma coughed and said, "Lu Chen asked me to send his regards to you, and he said that it's not that he doesn't want to go up the mountain, but **T. Perfected Tianlan suddenly interrupted Old Ma impatiently and said, "That brat is used to being arrogant and detestable. He even dares to scold me in front of me, so how could he be so polite behind my back? Tell me the truth, what he said." Old Ma gave a hollow laugh and secretly looked at Perfected Tianlan's expression. Not daring to hide it anymore, he could only say, "Well, Your Excellency, Lu Chen is still young." Before he finished his words, he saw Perfected Tianlan's expression change again. Old Ma's heart skipped a beat, and he did not dare to argue anymore. He hurriedly said, "Go back and tell the damn baldy that I'll wait here for a night, and if I don't come tonight, I'll leave tomorrow." After saying that, Old Ma only felt a chill on his back. He could not help but subconsciously look at Perfected Tianlan's shiny skull in front of him, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead. There was silence in the cave residence. Old Ma did not dare to look at Perfected Tianlan's expression, and he even subconsciously held his breath. After a while, Perfected Tian suddenly snorted and said, "It does sound like what that brat said. He's simply reckless, audacious, and rebellious." After saying those words in a serious tone that made Old Ma's expression change, Perfected Tianlan stood up and walked out of the cave residence. At the same time, he calmed down and said to Old Ma, "Let's go and see that good-for-nothing guy." Old Ma said, Chapter 387. The small forest where Lu Chen and Atsu stayed was actually some distance away from the Immortal City, and it was also far away from the busy official roads. It was a very secluded place. When night fell, the huge city in the distance was brightly lit, while the forest here was dark and gloomy, as if they were two different worlds. Lu Chen sat quietly in the forest, his figure almost integrated with the surrounding darkness, looking like a vague shadow in the night, indistinct and difficult to distinguish. Atsu lay quietly beside him, a pair of dark green eyes shimmering in the darkness. Occasionally, it would look up at the sky, as if there was something it was interested in the boundless sky. The night was quiet, and there was no other sound except the sound of the night wind blowing through the treetops. But the city in the distance was too big and too prosperous. Even at such a distance, Lu Chen could still feel the invisible aura emitted from that place. That was the place that all the cultivators in the world yearned for. At this time, suddenly footsteps came from outside the forest, and then a fat and burly figure appeared in their sight. The person who came was Supreme Tianlan. However, with Supreme Tianlan's cultivation realm, if he really wanted to hide from their eyes and ears, he would naturally have countless means and divine sense to get close without being noticed. But this damn baldy didn't seem to want to do so, and he walked directly over. Perhaps he even increased his pace to remind Lu Chen of the fact that he had come here. Lu Chen stood up and looked behind Supreme Tianlan, who was slowly walking over, but found that there was no one behind Supreme Tianlan. He was startled and slightly frowned. Tianlan walked to Lu Chen, his face calm and his eyes deep, but in the end, a trace of complex light flashed across. After a moment, he smiled and said, "Long time no see." Lu Chen sighed, and his mood was a little complicated. The person in front of him had always been entangled with his fate in the first half of his life. He was indebted to him, but it seemed that he had betrayed his former friendship. He fled to the chaotic land, and finally fell into the southern wilderness. In fact, it was not a short time, but not too long either. From the beginning to the end, it was only a few years. But at this moment, under the night sky, beside the bustling city. When he saw this person again, Lu Chen still felt a sense of vicissitudes in his heart. Long time, no see. Lu Chen also nodded. Tianlan looked at Lu Chen up and down, then glanced at Atu beside him, the black dog that was unusually large and looked like a giant wolf demonic beast 100 times larger than an ordinary dog. Tianlan's gaze suddenly paused for a moment, as if he was slightly surprised. He looked at it a few more times, but then he turned away and looked at Lu Chen again. "Where's old Ma?" Chen asked. "Oh, he's waiting outside the woods," Tianlan said. "I think it's more casual for us to talk this time, just the two of us, so don't let him follow us in." Speaking of this, Tianlan smiled and said, "In the end, little Ma is just a messenger between the two of us. In the end, we still have to say what we want to say, don't we? Or, could it be that you've been with him for so long that you actually trust him more than me?" Lu Chen's heart suddenly shrank, but his expression did not change. Without a moment of hesitation or pause, he shook his head and said, "Of course not." Tianlan chuckled and casually waved his wide robe sleeve. A gust of wind swept past, immediately blowing away the fallen leaves and dust in the woods, revealing a cleaner space. Then, this perfected lord of the divine transformation realm, who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, actually did not take it to heart. He casually sat down in front of Lu Chen and at the same time called out to Lu Chen, "Come, come, sit down and talk. It's so tiring to stand." This damn bald fatty would not feel tired even if he stood for a year. Lu Chen secretly criticized in his heart. Then, he still sat down and said, "I heard from old Ma that it was you who wanted to see me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "That's right. I haven't heard from you for several years. I only know that you escaped into the depths of the land of chaos and finally fell into the Longchuan River. So when I heard that you suddenly came back, of course I wanted to see you." Lu Chen was silent for a moment. Then, he looked up at Tianlan and said, "All these years, you always thought that I was dead, right?" Tianlan shook his head and said, "No, I always believed that you were still alive." Lu Chen smiled and said, "You actually have so much confidence in me. It's hard for an ordinary person to come back alive after falling into the river." Tianlan said lightly, "You're someone that I personally taught. How can you be an ordinary person?" Lu Chen was stunned and did not say anything. Tianlan continued, "Moreover, if I didn't believe that you were still alive, do you think I would allow He to live well just because I forced you to die?" Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said, "He, perfected Lord Tianlan said, hunting you down is a great achievement. You can't possibly think that he would hide it from you, right? He told me everything from the beginning to the end. He even wanted to take me as his master and inherit my Taoism." Lu Chen's expression became somewhat complicated. At that moment, he did not seem to know what to say. Finally, he smiled bitterly and said, "Then what did you do with him in the end?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "I told him that he did a good job, but it was still not enough for him to inherit my Taoism. I told him to cultivate more diligently. At the same time, I also transferred him from Kunlun Mountain to Zhengxianmeng to work for me. Now, he can be considered as one of my generals." Lu Chen sighed and said, "Good move." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "What move? It sounds like you're a little disdainful about it. Let's not talk about anything else. He didn't have any complaints at all and treated me like a talent scout. In order to strive for the top, his diligence and vigor are much stronger than yours." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "I know, I also had that vigor before. But it was almost worn away when I was in the devil cult more than 10 years ago." A trace of anger suddenly flashed across perfected Lord Tianlan's face. He stared at Lu Chen and the darkness around his fat body seemed to suddenly surge, like a demon beast suddenly roaring in the dark void. But very soon, Tianlan seemed to think of something again. His gaze on Lu Chen gradually softened. After a while, he sighed softly. "Do you still blame me?" Tianlan asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen shook his head and said, "In the first few years, when I was burned to death by the black fire, I was indeed a little dissatisfied with you. But later, I gradually got over it. If you hadn't saved me back then, I wouldn't be where I am now. So, just take it as me repaying your kindness. Tianlong stared at him and said, You've really gotten over it? If there's anything in your heart that you're unhappy about, you might as well tell me. Luchen said, I've gotten over it. Anyway, those things are in the past. He paused and looked up at Tianlong, saying, This time, I do have a few things to ask you. Go ahead. Luchen paused and said, Su Qingjun, and how is the Su family in Kunwa City now? Perfected Lord Tianlong looked at him indifferently. After a while, he suddenly smiled. His smile was gentle, but there was a hint of coldness in his eyes. Chapter 388. There was a moment of silence in the forest. Luchen raised his head slightly and looked at Tianlong. After a while, Tianlong said, Didn't you ask little Ma about this before you came? Luchen said, I did, but old Ma didn't tell me much. He only said a few words and didn't want to say more. I think he was afraid that I would find out something and get angry. Maybe he wouldn't come to Immortal City and would run to Kunlun Mountain out of anger. Perfected Lord Tianlong was stunned for a while, then he laughed and said, It's funny, but thinking about little Ma, it might really be possible. Luchen smiled and said, That's why I thought I'd come and ask you myself. Tianlong nodded and said, Su Qingjun is a good girl. Back then, that incident caused a storm in the city. There were people in the Su family and Kunlun sect who blamed and criticized her. She didn't defend herself and just took it. In the past few years, she only focused on cultivation and made great progress. If there are no accidents, it shouldn't be a problem for her to easily reach the Yuanying realm. Luchen was silent for a while and then said, It seems that she is not far from the truth to be able to get such a comment from you, a perfected lord of soul formation. Tianlong smiled and didn't say anything. His expression was calm, as if what he said just now was a matter of course and had unshakable confidence. From what you said just now, the Su family seems to have a big reaction? Luchen asked again. Of course. Tianlong snorted and said, Back then, you went crazy and directly rushed into their mansion and killed Sumo in front of so many people. How do you think the Su family will react? Luchen said expressionlessly, I didn't kill wrongly and I don't regret it. Perfected Lord Tianlong waved his hand casually and said after a while, Yes, you're right. The Su family was so angry that they wanted to get to the bottom of this. After you escaped, the Su family was not willing to let you go. They went back to the faction to investigate you. Not only did they want to investigate your background, but they also wanted to find out how you entered the Kunlun party. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. They probably wanted to find your relatives and family by following the vines. Hearing this, Lu Chen's expression became strange. Even though he never liked the Su family, the only exception was probably Su Qingjun. However, upon hearing Perfected Lord Tianlong's words, Lu Chen still had an indescribable sense of absurdity. How did he join the Kunlun party? It was arranged by Perfected Lord Tianlong. What background does he have? Does he have a backer? Of course, the most powerful deity in the Kunlun sect was his backer. In the eyes of those who knew the inside story, the Su family's aggressive investigation was really a bit suicidal. Then how did you stop them from investigating? Lu Chen asked, Was it troublesome? Tianlong snorted and said, Of course it was troublesome. You're the only one who knows how to make trouble. But it's just like that. I just made some arrangements so that they couldn't investigate further. Then what did you do to the Su family? Lu Chen looked at Tianlong with an inquiring look in his eyes. Tianlong said, I didn't do anything to them. I've been reorganizing the faction these years and didn't want to get involved. But old Ma told me about the grievances you suffered in the Su family. I just wanted to wait for you to come back and see what you think. Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, Is it important what I think? How you deal with the Su family depends on me. Perfected Lord Tianlong said calmly, Well, it's up to you. No matter what, you're mine. Since you suffered in their hands, it's only right for me to take revenge. The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched and he lowered his head slightly. After a moment, he said calmly, Forget it. The only one in the Su family who really hated me was Sumo, and he was killed by me. The others didn't have much to do with me, but Su Qingjun had a good relationship with me in that year. Let's stop this matter. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered and he said, let's stop here? Lu Chen nodded and said, yes, let's stop here. Don't get others involved. You said you had a few things to ask me. What about the other things? Tianlan asked. Lu Chen didn't know why, but when he looked at this fat and burly man, his original mood suddenly became a little bleak. He couldn't lift his spirits and felt more helpless. He was silent for a long time and then said with a wry smile, forget it. I suddenly don't want to talk about other things. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and didn't get angry at Lu Chen's words. It seemed that this high-ranking perfected lord of Huashan realm did have a whole new level of respect for the young man in front of him. He even seemed to know Lu Chen very well and was particularly tolerant of Lu Chen. He even said a few more words to Lu Chen, by the way, I also know about Exen. Lu Chen's body trembled slightly and he looked up. Tianlan said, the girl's body was taken back by her family and given a proper burial. I also asked the Kunlun sect to put in some effort to arrange a grand funeral for her. Let's just take it as us making it up to her a little. Lu Chen took a deep breath and then slowly stood up and said, when Exen was alive, she didn't seem to like this kind of thing very much. But I know her intention, and I think Exen's parents can also feel it. I thank you on behalf of that unfortunate girl. After saying that, he straightened his expression and solemnly bowed to perfected Lord Tianlan and then said, if Exen knows in the underworld, she will definitely want me to thank you on her behalf. Perfected Lord Tianlan calmly accepted the bow. When Lu Chen straightened up again, he said, whether you still want to ask or not, since I'm here tonight, I naturally want to have a good talk with you. If you've said everything you want to know and know everything you want to know, then it's my turn to say it now, right? Lu Chen nodded and said, go ahead. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, come back and help me. Lu Chen paused for a moment and then said with a wry smile, with your power and strength, what kind of talent can't you find? Why do you insist on me coming back? Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly, there are many people who want to help me, but I can't think of anyone else who is worthy of my complete trust and can be entrusted with such important matters by me. Lu Chen coughed and said, I've been listening to this kind of flattery for 10 years. I've long known that it's just a big empty pie in the sky. Don't lie to me. Perfected Lord Tianlan said with a smile, I'm not lying to you. I'm telling the truth. Lu Chen shook his head and said, I heard from Old Ma that you've recently transferred many young experts from the Kunlun party over, and half of them have joined Fuyunji. These people are of the same lineage as you, so you can trust them in everything they do. Tianlan said, those people are passable, but I still can't trust them completely. And this time, there's one thing I still only trust in you. Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, a bitter expression appeared on his face and he said, the devil cult again? Yes, Tianlan said, it's the devil cult again. It has to be you. Bullsh *T. Lu Chen scolded, last time in Kunlun Mountain, you also said the same thing to me. In the end, there were only a few people from the devil cult on Kunlun Mountain. Instead, it was your two perfected lords and several major factions that were fighting among themselves. I'm not going to join in the fun. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.